Chapter 1. The Weight of Words. There's a moment in Season 2 I keep coming back to. Not the walker in the well, not Shane's unravelling, something quieter. Dale Horvath standing in the centre of Herschel's barn, his weathered hands clasped behind his back, like a college professor who has something important to say. The late afternoon light slants through the warped boards, catching dust motes that drift around him like snow. He's looking at each face in turn, Rick, Shane, Darryl, Andrea, Glenn, and you can see him choosing his words with the care of someone who knows this might be his only chance to save more than just Randall's life. What if Dale's words had been enough? What if the moral argument he made that day, about lines we cross and can't uncross, about the difference between surviving and remaining human, had actually reached them? Tonight, let's follow that thread and see where it leads. The barn smells like hay and motor oil, and something else underneath. The metallic tang of fear that's been soaking into this place ever since they brought Randall here. Dale can feel it in his chest, that familiar ache that comes when he watches good people preparing to do something that will change them forever. He's seen it before, in his own life, in the early days after the dead started walking. The moment when you realize that every choice you make now is a choice about who you're going to become. We're talking about taking a life, he says, and his voice carries that particular gravity he reserves for the most important conversations. Not in self-defense, not in the heat of battle, but in cold blood. Because we've decided this boy is dangerous. Because we've decided we can't take the risk of letting him live. Rick stands near the barn door, one hand resting on his gun belt in that unconscious gesture that's become as natural as breathing. The sheriff in him understands Dale's argument, has always understood it. But the father in him, the man responsible for keeping his family alive in this world, that part of him has been calculating odds and distances and threats since the moment they learned about Randall's group. 30 men, heavily armed, willing to attack strangers for sport. The math seems simple, but Dale keeps talking, and there's something in his voice that makes the math feel less certain. I know what you're thinking, Dale says, looking directly at Rick now. You're thinking about Carl, about Laurie, about keeping them safe. I'm not asking you to put them at risk. I'm asking you to remember that how we protect them matters as much as whether we protect them. Shane shifts against the barn wall, his jaw working like he's chewing words he doesn't want to swallow. This is a waste of time, he mutters, but even he doesn't move to cut Dale off. Something about the older man's certainty holds the room in place. Andrea watches Dale with the expression she gets when she's trying to see all the angles of a problem. She's been different since Amy died, harder in some ways, but there's still that part of her that remembers teaching children at the camp, that remembers what it felt like to believe in mercy. Glenn stands beside her, shifting his weight from foot to foot, looking like he wishes he were anywhere else. But he's listening. I've been thinking about Carl, Dale continues, and Rick's attention sharpens like a blade. About what happened yesterday, when he found that walker in the swamp, the way he looked at it. Not afraid, not disgusted, curious, like he was trying to figure out how it worked. The silence that follows is different from the one before. This silence has weight. Kids adapt, Rick says finally, but there's something defensive in his voice that wasn't there a moment ago. They do, Dale agrees. That's what scares me. Carl's adapting to a world where we execute prisoners in barns, where we solve problems by killing people who might be problems later, and he's adapting faster than any of us want to admit. The truth of it sits in the barn like smoke. They've all seen it. The way Carl looks at walkers now, like puzzles to be solved rather than horrors to be feared. The way he started asking about guns and watches the adults make their hard choices with the kind of attention that suggests he's taking notes. Andrea finds herself thinking about Amy again, about how young she was, how quickly the world taught her that innocence was a luxury they couldn't afford. But Amy had still been Amy, right up until the end, still laughing at inappropriate moments, still believing that tomorrow might be better than today. What would it have done to her to watch them execute a boy who might or might not deserve it? There's another way, Dale says, and now he's speaking to all of them, not just Rick. We find out what he knows about his group. We learn what we can about their movements, their capabilities. Then we take him far from here, far enough that he can't lead them back to us, and we let him go. With what guarantee he won't come back? Shane asks, but his voice lacks its usual edge. Even he seems to be considering possibilities. With no guarantees, Dale admits, but with the knowledge that we tried to find a third option, that we looked for a way to stay safe without becoming the kind of people who kill prisoners. Glenn clears his throat, the sound surprisingly loud in the quiet barn. What if we're wrong about his group? What if they're not as dangerous as he's making them sound? Then we've killed an innocent man, Dale says simply. The words hang in the air like a judgment. Rick closes his eyes for a long moment, and when he opens them, something has shifted in his expression. Not softness exactly, but a recognition of the complexity that Shane's black and white thinking has been trying to avoid. You really think we can do this? Rick asks. Question him. Learn what we need to know. Then just trust that letting him go won't come back to haunt us. I think we can try, Dale says. And I think how we try matters more than we want to admit. Andrea nods slowly. He's right about Carl, she says, looking at Rick with something like apology. I've been watching him too. The way he talks about walkers, about the people we've had to kill. He's starting to think it's normal. It is normal now, Rick says, but there's less conviction in his voice than before. It doesn't have to be the only normal, Dale replies. The afternoon light is fading, turning the dust motes into flecks of gold that drift between them like promises. Outside, they can hear the sounds of the farm settling into evening, Herschel calling his daughters in for supper, the distant lowing of cattle, the ordinary rhythms of a world that's trying to remember how to be peaceful. Rick looks around the barn at the faces of his people, his family, really, in all the ways that matter now. He sees doubt in some, resignation in others, but in Dale's eyes, he sees something else. Hope, maybe, or at least the stubborn refusal to let hope die without a fight. All right, he says, and the words feel heavy as stones in his mouth. We try it your way. We question him tomorrow, learn what we can. Then we take him far enough out that he can't find his way back. Shane straightens up from the wall. Rick? No, Rick says, but gently. Dale's right about one thing. How we do this matters. Maybe it matters more than whether we do it at all. The decision settles over them like evening itself, gradual, inevitable, changing the landscape in ways they won't fully understand until much later. Dale feels the ache in his chest begin to ease, replaced by something that might be relief or might just be the absence of dread. They'll question Randall in the morning, find out what he knows about his group's movements and capabilities. They'll make a plan, choose a route, take him far enough from the farm that he'll have to work to find his way back, if he even wants to try. It's not a perfect solution, but it's a human one. As they file out of the barn, Andrea catches Dale's arm. You really think this will work? Dale considers the question seriously, the way he considers all questions that matter. "I think it's worth trying," he says finally. "And I think years from now, when Carl asks us how we made our choices in this world, we'll be able to tell him we tried to find another way." The barn empties, except for the hay and the shadows, and the lingering sense that something important has shifted. In the farmhouse, Laurie is setting the table for dinner, and Carl is helping her, talking excitedly about something he saw in the woods. Soon they'll call the others in, and they'll sit around Herschel's table and share whatever food they've managed to find. And for a few hours they'll remember what it feels like to be a family instead of just survivors. But first, in the quiet of the barn, Dale allows himself a moment to believe that they've chosen correctly. That mercy is still possible, even here, even now. That the line between civilization and brutality hasn't been crossed yet. And maybe, just maybe, it never has to be. Tomorrow will bring new problems, new choices, new tests of whatever principles they've managed to hold on to. But tonight, they'll eat dinner together, and Carl will go to bed in a world where the adults around him still believe that how they survive matters as much as whether they survive. It's not much of a victory, maybe, but it's enough. For now, it's enough. Chapter 2. The Test of Mercy. The next morning arrives with a quality of light that makes everything look different than it did the night before. Randall sits in the corner of the barn where they've kept him, but his posture has changed. Yesterday he was hunched over like an animal waiting for the killing blow. Today he sits straighter, his eyes alert in a way that suggests hope might be a luxury he can afford again. Dale approaches him with a cup of water and something that might charitably be called breakfast: canned peaches and a piece of bread that's only slightly stale. It's the kind of gesture that would have meant nothing in the old world, but here, in this place where every calorie is counted and every kindness is weighed against survival, it carries the weight of philosophy made manifest. "I heard what you said yesterday," Randall says, accepting the food with hands that shake slightly. Not from fear this time, but from something that might be relief. "About giving me a chance." Dale settles himself on an overturned crate, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who has learned that rushing rarely improves anything. "Rick makes the final decisions," he says. "But yes, we're going to try a different way." What follows is a conversation that will reshape how this group thinks about intelligence gathering for years to come. Randall talks, and Dale listens with the kind of attention that makes people want to keep talking. Not the interrogation techniques that Shane would have preferred, all pressure and intimidation, but the gentler art of making someone feel heard. The information Randall provides is more valuable than any of them had dared to hope. His former group operates out of an old auto parts store about 40 miles north. 30 men, heavily armed, but not particularly well organized. They move in smaller groups usually, 5 or 6 at a time, hitting farmhouses and small communities for supplies and whatever else they can take. They have vehicles, but limited fuel. Their leader, a man called Dave, prefers to strike at dawn when people are sleepy and confused. But more importantly, Randall knows their weaknesses. Dave's paranoid about his own men, doesn't trust anyone with real authority. Half the group is addicted to pills they've found in various raids, which makes them unpredictable but also desperate. They've been moving further south because they've burned through most of the easily accessible supplies in their original territory. "They'll come this way eventually," Randall says, looking directly at Dale. "Not because they know about your group specifically, but because they're running out of easier targets. Give it 2 weeks, maybe 3, and they'll be scouting this area." Dale absorbs this information with the satisfaction of someone whose worldview is being validated in real time. This is what mercy looks like when it's practical rather than just idealistic. Not just sparing a life, but gaining intelligence that could save a dozen lives. But not everyone sees it that way. Shane finds Rick by the chicken coop, where he's been standing for the better part of an hour, staring at nothing in particular with the expression of someone trying to solve an impossible equation. The morning sun catches the sheriff's badge on his shirt, making it glint like a target. "So we're really doing this," Shane says without preamble. His voice has that particular flatness that Rick has learned to recognize as a warning sign. "We're really going to bet everyone's lives on the word of some kid who was ready to kill Glenn just yesterday." Rick turns to face him, and there's something different in his expression than there was even 12 hours ago. Not softer, exactly, but more complex, like someone who has decided that simple answers are a luxury he can't afford anymore. "We're going to use every advantage we can get," Rick says carefully, including information that could help us stay ahead of threats instead of just reacting to them. "Information," Shane repeats, and there's contempt in the word. From someone whose friends were going to rape Maggie before they killed her. Someone who watched it happen and didn't say a word to stop it. The accusation hangs between them like a blade. Rick doesn't deny it, because they both know it's probably true. The world has taught them that most people will stand by and watch terrible things happen rather than risk their own safety. But the world has also taught them that people can change, that circumstances can transform cowards into heroes or heroes into monsters, often in the space of a single decision. "Maybe," Rick says, "but that was before. This is now." Shane laughs, but there's no humor in it. Before and after, like there's some magical line that changes everything. Like mercy is a switch you can flip and suddenly the wolves become sheep. There's something desperate in Shane's voice that makes Rick study his face more carefully. His friend looks like he hasn't slept, which isn't unusual these days. But there's something else. A wildness around his eyes that suggests the philosophical ground shifting under their feet is affecting him more than anyone else. "Dale's approach got us actionable intelligence in one morning," Rick says. "Your approach would have gotten us a body." "My approach would have gotten us safety," Shane snaps back. "But I guess that's not as important as feeling good about ourselves." The conversation is interrupted by Glenn jogging toward them from the direction of the barn, his face flushed with something that might be excitement. Behind him, Dale approaches at his more measured pace, but there's satisfaction in his bearing that suggests good news. "You need to hear this," Glenn says, slightly out of breath. "Randall knows about their patrol patterns. He knows when they're likely to hit this area, and he knows how they scout ahead." Shane looks between Glenn and Dale like they're speaking a foreign language. "So what? We still have to assume they're hostile. We still have to assume they'll kill us all if they find us." "We do," Dale agrees, surprising everyone, including Shane. "But now we know how to avoid them, or how to be ready if we can't." What Dale doesn't say, but everyone understands, is that this kind of intelligence is exactly what they've been lacking. For months they've been reactive, responding to threats as they materialized, always one step behind and scrambling to catch up. The information Randall has provided gives them something they've never had before, the ability to anticipate and prepare. Over the next few hours, they put together a security protocol based on what they've learned. T-Dog and Darryl will set up observation posts along the routes that Randall says the group is most likely to use. Andrea and Glenn will establish fallback positions in case they need to evacuate quickly. Even Herschel, despite his initial reluctance to turn his farm into a military installation, contributes suggestions about defensive positions and escape routes. It's the kind of planning that requires trust, Trust that the information is accurate. Trust that the person providing it isn't setting a trap. Trust that mercy can coexist with pragmatism. Shane participates, but his body language suggests he's going through the motions rather than committing to the strategy. As afternoon fades toward evening, Dale finds himself in an unfamiliar position. Instead of being the voice calling for restraint while others plan violence, he's become the architect of a defensive strategy that could save all their lives. The moral choice he advocated for has produced practical results in ways that even he hadn't fully anticipated. But the victory feels incomplete because he can see what it's costing Shane. There's a moment just before dinner when Dale catches Shane standing alone near the edge of Herschel's property, staring out at the tree line like he's looking for something that isn't there. His posture reminds Dale of how Randall looked yesterday morning, like an animal backed into a corner, unsure whether to fight or flee. Dale approaches carefully, the way he might approach a spooked horse. "You're not wrong about the risks," he says quietly. Shane turns, and there's surprise in his face at the acknowledgement. But being right about the risks doesn't mean there's only one way to handle them, Dale continues. Rick's not choosing mercy over safety. He's choosing a different kind of safety, one that might let us stay human while we stay alive. Human, Shane says, and there's something broken in his voice. You know what's human, Dale? Fear, selfishness, doing whatever it takes to protect the people you care about, even if it means damning everyone else. That's human. This idealistic crap you're selling, that's fantasy. Dale considers this, because Shane isn't entirely wrong. The capacity for brutality is as human as the capacity for mercy, and pretending otherwise would be naive. But he spent too many years watching people choose which part of their humanity to cultivate to believe that cruelty is inevitable. Maybe, he says finally. But if we're going to be human, shouldn't we try to be the best version of human we can manage? Shane doesn't answer, but something in his expression shifts. Not agreement, exactly, but a recognition that the conversation is more complicated than he wants it to be. That night, as the farm settles into the routines that help them pretend normalcy is still possible, Dale doesn't take his usual evening walk. Instead, he stays close to the house, helping Carol with the dishes, listening to Glenn and Maggie talk about the observation posts they'll establish tomorrow, watching Carl practice his reading with one of Herschel's old medical textbooks. It's a small change, but it represents something larger. Dale's argument for mercy hasn't just saved Randall's life or provided them with valuable intelligence. It's created a different kind of community, one where the moral voice isn't just tolerated, but integrated into practical decision-making. Tomorrow will bring new tests, new opportunities to prove that mercy and pragmatism can coexist. But tonight, as Dale sits on the porch, listening to the ordinary sounds of a family preparing for bed, he allows himself to believe that they've chosen a path that leads somewhere better than just survival. The decision to spare Randall was never really about Randall at all. It was about who they wanted to be in a world that seemed determined to strip away everything decent about human nature. And for the first time since the dead started walking, Dale has reason to hope they might just succeed in remaining themselves. Chapter 3. Fractures and Faith. The third night after the decision comes with the kind of darkness that makes people do things they wouldn't consider in daylight. Shane Walsh moves through that darkness like a man who has already made peace with being misunderstood. His footsteps careful and deliberate as he approaches the barn where Randall sleeps under what amounts to house arrest. Shane carries his service weapon, but more than that, He carries the weight of certainty. The kind of certainty that comes from watching everything you believe about survival being slowly dismantled by people you love, people you've bled with, people who should know better. In his mind, what he's about to do isn't murder. It's mathematics. One life weighed against a dozen, maybe more. The kind of equation that should be simple if you strip away sentiment and face reality. But Dale Horvath has always been inconveniently good at reading the signs of trouble. He's been watching Shane for 2 days now, noting the way his old friend holds himself apart from the group's planning sessions, the way he looks at Randall like a problem that needs solving. Dale has seen that expression before, in other conflicts, in other desperate men who believed that the world's brutality justified their own. So when Dale sees the barn door standing slightly ajar at 2 a.m, when it should be secured, he knows what he'll find inside. Shane is standing over Randall's sleeping form, his weapon drawn but not yet aimed, when Dale steps through the doorway. There's something almost tender in the way Shane looks at the boy. Not affection, but the kind of reluctant sympathy a veterinarian might feel before putting down a sick animal. "Don't," Dale says quietly, and the single word carries enough weight to stop Shane's hand from moving toward the trigger. Shane turns slowly, and in the dim light filtering through the barn's warped boards, Dale can see that his friend's face is wet with tears. Not the tears of rage or frustration, but something deeper and more broken. The tears of someone who believes he's about to save everyone he loves by damning himself. "You don't understand," Shane whispers, and his voice cracks on the words. "You think this is about cruelty, about choosing the easy way. But it's not. It's about tomorrow. It's about next week when his people come looking for him. It's about Carl growing up in a world where we're all dead, because we were too noble to make the hard choice." Dale steps closer, moving with the careful precision of someone approaching a dangerous animal. Not because Shane would hurt him. Dale doesn't believe that, even now, but because Shane is in the kind of pain that makes people unpredictable. "I do understand," Dale says, and there's genuine compassion in his voice. "I understand that you're terrified, that you've been carrying the weight of keeping everyone safe for so long that you can't imagine any other way. But this isn't the way, Shane. This won't make us safer. It'll just make us different." Shane laughs, but the sound is hollow and bitter. "Different? You say that like it's something we have a choice about. Like we haven't all already become different from who we used to be. Like mercy is something we can afford in a world full of people who want to rape our women and murder our children." "Maybe," Dale acknowledges. "But if we're going to change, shouldn't we have a say in how we change? Shouldn't we choose what we become instead of just letting the world decide for us?" The conversation might have continued, might have found some middle ground where 2 good men with different philosophies could find a way forward together. But Carl Grimes chooses that moment to appear in the barn doorway, drawn by voices that should not exist in the middle of the night. The boy takes in the scene with the kind of quick assessment that children in this world develop early. Shane with his gun drawn, Randall beginning to stir from sleep, Dale standing between them like a human shield. In the old world, Carl might have run for help or frozen in shock, but this version of Carl, shaped by Dale's influence as much as by necessity, makes a different choice. "Uncle Shane, don't," Carl says, and there's something in his voice that might have been enough to reach Shane if the man hadn't been so far gone into his own desperation. But Shane turns toward Carl with the gun still in his hand, and something fundamental shifts in the barn's atmosphere. Not because Shane means to threaten the boy. Dale can see that Shane would die before hurting Carl deliberately. But because the gun is there, and Carl is there, and in this world, those two facts together create a mathematics of their own. "Go back to the house, buddy," Shane says, but his voice is wrong, too high and too tight. This is grown-up stuff. "I know what you're doing," Carl says, and now there's steel in his 12-year-old voice that shouldn't exist, but does. "I know you think you're protecting us. But Dale's right. This isn't who we're supposed to be." Shane's face contorts with something that might be anguish or might be rage, and for a moment that stretches like an eternity, Dale can see the exact moment when Shane realizes he's lost. Not just this argument, but the larger war for the soul of their group. Carl, the boy Shane has helped raise, has protected, has loved like a son, has chosen sides, and it isn't Shane's side. "You don't understand," Shane says again. But now the words sound like a prayer that's lost its faith. "None of you understand what it takes to keep people alive in this world." And then Shane does something that will haunt Dale for the rest of his days. He turns the gun around and presses the barrel against his own temple. "Maybe," Shane says, "maybe you're right. Maybe I've become something that doesn't belong in your new world." The shot that echoes through the barn doesn't come from Shane's weapon. It comes from Carl's. The boy moves with the kind of terrible precision that combat teaches, drawing the .22 pistol his father gave him and firing in one smooth motion that speaks to hours of practice and a clarity of purpose that should terrify anyone who witnesses it. But the shot isn't aimed at Shane's head or heart. It's aimed at his shoulder, at the arm holding the gun to his own skull. Shane spins and falls, crying out in pain and shock, his weapon skittering across the barn floor to land at Dale's feet. For a moment, the only sound is Shane's labored breathing and Randall's startled whimpering from his corner. Then Rick's voice cuts through the night air like a blade. "What the hell is going on out here?" The next few minutes blur together in a confusion of voices and explanations and accusations. Rick and Darrell and Glenn and the others crowding into the barn, drawn by the gunshot. Shane on the ground, bleeding but alive, staring at Carl with an expression that cycles through shock and betrayal, and something that might be pride. Randall pressed against the barn wall, his eyes wide with the understanding that he's just witnessed something that will change everything. But it's Carl's voice that cuts through the chaos, steady and clear, and carrying a wisdom that no child should have to possess. "He was going to kill himself," Carl says, and the words hit the assembled group like physical blows. "I couldn't let him do that. Even if he was wrong about everything else, I couldn't let him think that dying was the only way to fix it." Dale looks at the boy, this child who has learned Dale's lessons about the value of human life so thoroughly that he would wound a man to save him from himself, and feels something break open in his chest that might be pride or might be heartbreak. Shane's wound isn't life-threatening, but it's serious enough to require immediate attention. As Herschel works to clean and bandage the damage, as Shane drifts in and out of consciousness thanks to the veterinarian's supply of morphine, the group gathers to decide what comes next. The conversation that follows is unlike any they've had before, not because they're discussing Shane's fate. He'll live, he'll heal, and eventually he'll have to decide whether he can accept their new philosophy or find somewhere else to go. But because they're discussing it as a group that has been fundamentally changed by witnessing mercy in action, even in the middle of crisis. Randall, freed from his bonds for the first time since his capture, speaks up during the discussion. His voice is quiet but steady, and what he says will echo through their future decisions for years to come. "I know you don't have any reason to trust me," he says, looking around at faces that range from sympathetic to skeptical. "But what just happened here, what your boy did for a man who was ready to kill me, that's something I've never seen before. Not since this all started. Maybe not ever." He pauses, swallowing hard before continuing. "My group, the people I was with, they would have watched a man eat his gun and called it natural selection. They would have put a bullet in my head 2 days ago and slept fine that night. But you people, you're trying to stay human. And if you'll have me, if you think I can learn to be the kind of person who belongs here, I'd like to try." The offer hangs in the night air like a challenge, not just to accept Randall into their group, but to commit fully to the path they've chosen. To believe that people can change, that mercy can be practical, that the line between civilization and brutality doesn't have to be crossed just because the world has ended. It's Rick who answers, speaking for all of them but looking directly at Dale as he does. "We'll try," he says. "All of us. Together." When morning comes, it finds them preparing to leave Herschel's farm. Not because they have to. The threat from Randall's former group is still manageable, thanks to the intelligence they've gained. But because staying would mean pretending that last night didn't change everything, and none of them are interested in pretending anymore. Shane will come with them, his arm in a sling, and his worldview shattered, but his life intact. Randall will come too, no longer a prisoner, but a probationary member whose loyalty will be earned rather than forced. And Carl will carry the weight of having shot a man to save him, another lesson in the complicated mathematics of mercy that will shape who he becomes. As they load the last of their supplies into whatever vehicles they can find, Dale allows himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Not because everything has worked out perfectly. Shane's breakdown proves that their new path won't be easy for everyone to follow, but because they've proven that another way is possible, even here, even now. The road ahead will bring new challenges, new tests of their commitment to remaining human while staying alive. But they'll face those challenges together, as a group that has chosen to believe that how they survive matters as much as whether they survive. It's not much of a victory, maybe. But it's enough. For now, it's enough. Chapter 4. The Prison of Principles. The West Georgia Correctional Facility emerges from the morning mist like something out of a fever dream, its concrete walls and razor wire promising safety and containment in equal measure. After 8 months of sleeping in cars and abandoned buildings, of never staying anywhere long enough to call it home, the sight of those walls makes everyone in the group feel something they haven't felt since Herschel's farm burned behind them. Hope. Randall points out the weak spots in the perimeter, before anyone else even thinks to look for them. His months with the group have transformed him from a frightened prisoner into something approaching a tactical advisor, and his voice carries quiet authority as he explains what he sees. Guard towers give good sight lines, but they're also traps if you get overwhelmed, he says, pointing to the structures that rise above the fence line. The real strength is in the courtyards. Multiple barriers, choke points you can control. If we can clear the outer yard, we can take this place section by section. Rick stands beside him, studying the prison with the expression of someone trying to see all the angles at once. The months on the road have changed Rick in ways that go deeper than the beard he's grown or the weight he's lost. Dale's influence has tempered the hardness that was beginning to form after Shane's breakdown, creating something more complex than simple survival instinct. "What about the people inside?" Rick asks, and the question would have surprised anyone who knew him before the farm. The old Rick, the pre-Dale Rick, would have asked about supplies and defensive positions. This Rick asks about the human cost first. There could be prisoners still alive in there, Dale says, moving to join them at the fence line. The months have aged him too, but in his case, it seems to have distilled something essential rather than wearing it away. People who've been trapped just like we were, just trying to survive. Laurie approaches from where she's been helping Carol and Andrea organize their meager supplies. At 7 months pregnant, every step requires careful consideration, but her voice carries the authority of someone who has learned to see the bigger picture. If there are people inside, we need to know who they are before we decide what to do about them, she says. We can't just assume they're threats, but we also can't assume they're allies. It's the kind of balanced thinking that has become the group's default since they left the farm, and it reflects how thoroughly Dale's philosophy has taken root. The old group would have planned an assault designed to eliminate any potential threats. This group plans a reconnaissance mission designed to gather information and assess possibilities. Darryl volunteers to scout the perimeter, moving with the silent precision that has kept them all alive through the long winter. Randall goes with him, his knowledge of tactical approaches proving invaluable as they map potential entry points and escape routes. What they find confirms what they hoped. The prison is secure enough to provide real safety, but not so impregnable that they can't take it. More importantly, they find signs of life inside. Smoke from the kitchen area, movement in the cafeteria windows, the kind of organized activity that suggests not just survivors, but a functioning community. 5 of them, maybe 6, Darryl reports when they return, moving around the cafeteria like they own the place. Could be inmates, could be guards, could be people like us who just found shelter. Only one way to find out, Rick says, but there's something different in his voice than there would have been months ago. Not reluctance, exactly, but a recognition that how they make contact matters as much as whether they succeed. Dale suggests they try to establish communication before they attempt entry. It's the kind of suggestion that would have been dismissed as naive back at the farm, but the months of survival have taught them that Dale's instincts are often more practical than they appear. They position themselves near the cafeteria windows and use a combination of hand signals and shouted introductions to make contact. The response they get is cautious, but not hostile. Voices calling back questions about their numbers, their intentions, their willingness to negotiate rather than fight. The conversation that follows, conducted through prison bars and reinforced glass, will shape how they think about community building for years to come. The prisoners, and they are prisoners, convicted criminals who were trapped when the dead started walking, tell a story that's both familiar and unique. Been 5 of us for the last 4 months, says a man who introduces himself as Axel, his voice carrying the particular weariness of someone who has been surviving on luck and willpower. Started with more, but winter's hard on everyone. We've got food, got water, got walls that keep the walkers out. What we don't got is any reason to think you people won't just take what we have and leave us for dead. It's a fair question, and Rick answers it honestly. We're looking for a place to build something more permanent than just survival. Somewhere we can raise children, grow food, maybe even start thinking about a future beyond just making it to tomorrow. If you people are willing to work together, there's no reason we can't all benefit. What emerges from this initial negotiation is something unprecedented in the post-apocalyptic world. A formal discussion about integration rather than conquest. Dale facilitates the conversation with the skill of someone who has spent decades mediating between different perspectives, and his presence seems to reassure the prisoners that this isn't a setup for betrayal. "You're serious about sharing this place?" asks another prisoner, a younger man named Oscar, who speaks with the careful precision of someone weighing every word. "Not just taking the best parts and pushing us into the worst? I'm serious about building a community where everyone contributes and everyone benefits," Rick replies. "But that means everyone follows the same rules, everyone pulls their weight, and everyone respects the same basic principles about how we treat each other." The negotiations take 3 days. 3 days of careful conversation, of establishing ground rules, of building trust between groups that have every reason to be suspicious of each other. Dale serves as an unofficial mediator, his moral authority giving weight to promises and helping both sides see past their immediate fears to longer-term possibilities. The breakthrough comes when Laurie goes into labor. It happens during one of the negotiation sessions, and the crisis forces both groups to make immediate decisions about cooperation. The prisoners have medical supplies but limited knowledge. The newcomers have Herschel's veterinary expertise but limited equipment. Working together becomes a necessity rather than a choice, and sometimes necessity creates trust more effectively than any amount of talking. Judith arrives in the early hours of the morning, her cries echoing through the prison corridors like an announcement of possibility. She's born into a world that's still dangerous, still unpredictable, but also into a community that has chosen to prioritize hope over fear, cooperation over conflict. "She's beautiful," says Big Tiny, the largest of the prisoners, his voice soft with wonder as he looks at the baby through the cafeteria window. "Been so long since I've seen something this new, this clean." The birth creates a momentum that carries both groups past their remaining reservations. By the time Judith is a week old, they've established a formal community structure that incorporates Dale's moral principles into practical governance. Not just rules about work assignments and resource distribution, but protocols for decision-making that require consideration of ethical implications alongside tactical necessities. Rick finds himself serving as both sheriff and philosopher, enforcing rules that prioritize community welfare while ensuring that individual rights aren't trampled in the name of collective security. It's a more complex kind of leadership than he ever imagined, but it's also more satisfying than the simple command structure he fell into during their early days on the road. The prisoners bring skills that complement what the group already has. Axel knows electrical systems and can restore power to parts of the prison. Oscar has experience with agriculture from a work program and can help them establish sustainable food production. Even Big Tiny, despite his size and intimidating appearance, proves to have a gentle touch with children and becomes one of Carl's favorite people in their expanded community. But more than practical skills, the prisoners bring perspective. They understand institutional living in ways that the newcomers don't, and their insights about managing group dynamics prove invaluable as they work to establish sustainable routines. "Thing about prison," Axel explains during one of their evening planning sessions, "is that it only works if everyone believes in the rules, not necessarily because they like them, but because they understand that following them is better than the chaos you get without them." It's a lesson that applies to more than just institutional living, and Dale seizes on it as a foundation for the community's moral framework. Rules aren't just about control, they're about creating space for people to be better than their worst impulses, to choose cooperation over competition even when they don't have to. The physical clearing of the prison proceeds with the same methodical cooperation that characterized their initial negotiations. Instead of a military assault, they plan a careful, room-by-room clearance that prioritizes safety over speed. Randall's tactical knowledge proves invaluable, but it's applied in service of a strategy that seeks to preserve rather than destroy. When they encounter walkers, they eliminate them efficiently, but without the savage satisfaction that characterized some of their earlier encounters. When they find evidence of other prisoners who didn't survive, they take time to give the dead proper burial rather than simply disposing of bodies. Small gestures, perhaps, but they establish a tone that shapes everything else they do. 3 months after first arriving at the prison, they've created something that none of them could have imagined during those desperate winter nights on the road. Not just a safe haven, but a functioning community with its own culture, its own traditions, its own sense of shared purpose. Carl celebrates his 13th birthday in the prison's cafeteria, surrounded by people who were strangers 6 months ago, but have become family through shared work and mutual respect. The cake is made from canned goods and prison supplies, but it's decorated with flowers that Beth grew in their improvised garden, and it represents something more valuable than any luxury from the old world. Dale watches the celebration from his usual spot near the window, his weathered face creased in what might be satisfaction or might just be relief. The boy he helped save from becoming a killer is growing up in a community that values human life, surrounded by people who understand that survival isn't just about staying alive, it's about staying human. Outside the prison walls, the world continues its slow descent into chaos and brutality. But inside, in the cafeteria where former prisoners and former survivors share cake and laughter and hope for tomorrow, something different is taking root. Something that suggests the apocalypse doesn't have to be the end of civilization. It might just be the beginning of a better kind of community than they ever had before. It's not perfect. Nothing in this world can be perfect. But it's proof that Dale's vision wasn't naive idealism. It was practical wisdom about what people can accomplish when they decide to trust each other instead of simply surviving each other. And for now, in this place they've built together. That's enough. Chapter 5. When wolves come to the door. The woman arrives at their gates like something out of a fever dream, her katana dripping with walker blood, and her eyes carrying the particular hollowness that comes from too many days alone on the road. Michonne Hawthorne doesn't speak at first, just stands at the prison fence, holding a basket of baby formula, like an offering to gods she's not sure she believes in anymore. In the old days, the pre-Dale days, the group might have kept her outside the fence indefinitely, interrogating her through the chain link until they were satisfied she posed no threat. But Dale's influence has created different protocols for approaching strangers, protocols built on the recognition that desperation makes people dangerous, but isolation makes them desperate. She's been carrying that formula for miles, Dale observes, studying Michonne's posture through the cafeteria windows. Nobody walks that far with something they don't need, especially something that heavy. Either she has a baby, or she knows someone who does. Rick nods, but his hand still rests on his weapon as he approaches the gate. The months at the prison have taught him to balance Dale's compassion with hard-won caution, to remain open to possibility while preparing for betrayal. It's a more complex kind of leadership than simple command, but it's proven more effective than either pure trust or pure paranoia. "We've got a new baby here," Rick calls through the fence, his voice carrying the particular warmth he reserves for potential allies. "If that formula is meant for us, we're grateful. If it's not, we understand, but we'd still like to talk." The conversation that follows will reshape how they think about first contact with strangers for years to come. Michonne doesn't just bring formula. She brings intelligence about the changing landscape around them, about groups that have formed and fallen, about the particular dangers that come with winter settlements and spring migrations. More importantly, she brings stories about a place called Woodbury, a walled community with electricity and hot showers, led by a man who calls himself the governor and promises safety in exchange for loyalty. It sounds too good to be true, which in Dale's experience usually means it is. "You been there?" Dale asks, settling into the rhythm of conversation that has become his specialty. Not interrogation, but the gentle art of encouraging people to share what they know. "Briefly," Michonne says, and there's something in her voice that suggests the brevity wasn't entirely voluntary. Long enough to see that the safety comes with a cost. The governor's good at making people feel secure, but security and freedom aren't always the same thing. The information sits uneasily with everyone who hears it. They've worked so hard to build a community based on cooperation rather than control, on shared decision-making rather than autocratic leadership. The idea of a place where safety requires surrendering autonomy feels like everything they've chosen not to become. But Michonne also brings news that hits closer to home. She's encountered people on the road who claim to be scouts for various communities, people asking pointed questions about the prison and the unusual group that's taken residence there. "Word's getting out," she says during one of their evening planning sessions, "about how you people do things, about the prisoners you negotiated with instead of killing, about the kid who shot his friend to save him from himself rather than letting him die. People are talking, and not all the people talking have good intentions." It's exactly what Dale feared would happen, and exactly what he hoped would happen all at the same time. Their reputation for mercy has begun to spread, creating both opportunities and vulnerabilities. Some people seek them out because they're looking for a different kind of community. Others target them because they perceive mercy as weakness. The distinction becomes critically important 3 weeks after Michonne's arrival, when Glenn and Maggie disappear during what should have been a routine supply run. The old group would have responded with immediate violence, tracking the kidnappers and mounting a rescue assault designed to overwhelm through superior firepower. This group takes time to gather information, to understand not just where Glenn and Maggie have been taken, but by whom and why. The answers they get are both better and worse than they hoped. Glenn and Maggie have been taken to Woodbury, the community Michonne described, but they weren't captured by random raiders. They were taken by a deliberate scouting party that knew exactly who they were and where they came from. Someone in Woodbury has been paying attention to the prison group's activities, and that someone has decided they represent either an opportunity or a threat. They're not just collecting supplies, Darryl reports after scouting the area where Glenn and Maggie were taken. This was planned, professional. Someone wanted our people specifically. Dale's first instinct is to propose negotiation. If Woodbury is a genuine community rather than just a raider base, there might be room for diplomatic solutions. Perhaps their people were taken as insurance against attack, or as leverage for negotiating resource-sharing agreements. Perhaps the governor is exactly what he claims to be, a leader trying to protect his people in a dangerous world. "We should try to make contact," Dale argues during the emergency council meeting they convene in the cafeteria. "Send someone to talk, to explain who we are and what we want. If this governor is reasonable, if Woodbury is really the kind of place Michonne described, then maybe we can work something out." But Rick's pragmatic side, sharpened by months of responsibility for a growing community, recognizes the tactical realities they face. Their people have been taken from neutral territory during a peaceful mission. Whatever the governor's motives, he's chosen to open negotiations through kidnapping rather than communication. That suggests either desperation or aggression, neither of which bodes well for diplomatic solutions. We prepare for the worst while hoping for the best, Rick decides, and the phrase has become something of a motto for their community. Dale's right that we should try talking, but we also need to be ready in case talking isn't enough. The dual preparation that follows reflects how thoroughly Dale's philosophy has integrated with tactical necessity. They plan a diplomatic mission designed to demonstrate their peaceful intentions while also planning a rescue operation designed to extract their people if diplomacy fails. Not either slash or thinking, but both slash and thinking that acknowledges the complexity of dealing with unknown quantities. Michonne volunteers to serve as their diplomatic contact, her familiarity with Woodbury making her the logical choice for initial reconnaissance. But her report, when she returns 2 days later, suggests that the situation is more complex than any of them anticipated. "The governor's interested in you," she tells Rick and Dale during a private briefing in Dale's makeshift office. "Very interested. He's been asking questions about your leadership structure, about how you make decisions, about the prisoners you integrated rather than eliminated. He's either planning to copy your approach, or he's trying to figure out how to exploit it." More troubling, Michonne reports that Andrea is in Woodbury, and that she's been serving as an informal spokesperson for the prison group's methods. Not intentionally, but through casual conversation with Woodbury residents who are curious about alternatives to their current system. Andrea's telling people about Dale's moral counsel, about how you debate major decisions rather than just implementing them, Michonne continues. Some of the Woodbury people are interested. The governor's not happy about that interest. The information creates a 3-dimensional chess problem that requires both diplomatic finesse and tactical awareness. The governor has their people, but he also has a community full of residents who might be sympathetic to their approach. Andrea is inadvertently undermining the governor's authority by describing a more democratic alternative, but she's also potentially putting herself in danger by doing so. Dale spends the next evening walking the prison perimeter, thinking through possibilities and implications with the methodical care that has kept them alive through multiple crises. The governor's interest in their community suggests recognition that their approach has been successful, but interest from an autocratic leader could lead to attempted co-optation, elimination, or conquest. He's afraid, Dale concludes during their next planning session, not of our weapons or our numbers, but of our ideas. A community built on cooperation threatens everything he's built on control. If his people start believing there's another way to organize society, his whole system becomes unstable. It's an insight that reframes everything they know about their situation. They're not just facing a potential military conflict, they're facing an ideological conflict. The governor doesn't just want their resources or their location. He wants to prove that their way of doing things is naive, unsustainable, ultimately doomed to failure. "So what do we do?" Carl asks, and there's something in his voice that suggests he already knows the answer won't be simple. "We prove him wrong," Rick says. "We show that mercy and strength can coexist, that people can choose cooperation over domination, that there's another way to rebuild the world." Outside the prison walls, winter is settling over the Georgia countryside, bringing with it the particular challenges that test every community's resilience. But inside the cafeteria, where former enemies have become allies, where democratic debate has replaced autocratic command, something valuable is taking root. The governor may see their approach as weakness to be exploited, but Dale sees it as strength to be demonstrated. The coming conflict will test not just their tactical capabilities, but their fundamental beliefs about human nature and social organization. In Woodbury, Andrea sits in her assigned quarters, thinking about conversations she's had with people who are hungry for alternatives to the governor's increasingly paranoid control. She doesn't know that her casual descriptions of the prison community's methods have created ripples of discontent that threaten the stability the governor has worked so hard to maintain. And in the prison, Glenn and Maggie wait in whatever secure location Woodbury uses for holding prisoners, hoping that their friends will find a way to bring them home without destroying the principles they've all worked so hard to build. The stage is set for a confrontation that will determine not just who survives, but what kind of world the survivors will build from the ashes of the old one. Dale's bet on human decency is about to face its greatest test, and the outcome will reshape the trajectory of post-apocalyptic civilization for years to come. Tomorrow will bring new intelligence, new decisions, new opportunities to prove that mercy and pragmatism can coexist even in the face of direct threats. But tonight, in the quiet of the prison corridors, the community Dale helped build prepares to defend not just their lives, but their values. It's not the kind of war anyone wanted to fight, but it might be the most important war any of them will ever face. Chapter 6. The Council of War and Peace. The rescue of Glenn and Maggie happens differently than anyone expected, precisely because Dale insists they approach it differently than anyone would expect. Instead of a nighttime assault designed to overwhelm Woodbury's defenses, they send Michonne back with a message that will either prevent a war or provoke one. The message is simple enough to fit on a single piece of paper, but complex enough to change everything. An offer to share resources, establish trade routes, and provide sanctuary for any Woodbury residents who prefer cooperative community structures to autocratic ones. It's signed by the entire prison council, including Axel and Oscar, former inmates whose names alone demonstrate that the offer comes from a community willing to integrate rather than just conquer. You think he'll actually consider it? Rick asks, as they watch Michonne disappear into the morning mist that rises from the Georgia countryside. The question carries weight because everyone knows that the governor's response will determine not just the fate of their two communities, but the kind of world they're all trying to build. I think he'll have to, Dale replies. But there's something in his voice that suggests he's not entirely convinced of his own optimism. His people will hear about the offer whether he wants them to or not. Michonne will make sure of that. And once people know there's an alternative, they start asking questions about why they're not allowed to choose it. The waiting that follows is the hardest thing any of them has done since arriving at the prison. Not because they're unprepared for violence. The months of community building have also included weapons training and defensive planning, but because they're hoping for something more complex than victory. They're hoping to prove that their approach to conflict resolution can work even when the stakes are highest. The first sign that their strategy might be working comes from an unexpected source. Merle Dixon appears at their gates 3 days after Michonne's departure, alone and carrying a white flag improvised from one of his own shirts. The brother Darrell thought was dead, the man who helped capture Glenn and Maggie, standing at their fence, asking for sanctuary. Governor's lost his mind, Merle says, without preamble, his voice carrying the particular exhaustion that comes from watching someone you respect become someone you can't follow. Started talking about making examples, about showing your people what happens when you challenge his authority. Half his soldiers are asking questions he don't want to answer. The conversation that follows reveals how thoroughly Dale's message has destabilized the governor's control over his community. Not through military pressure, but through the simple recognition that alternatives exist. People in Woodbury have begun asking why they can't visit the prison community, why trade negotiations aren't possible, why their leader responds to offers of cooperation with threats of violence. Martinez pulled me aside yesterday, Merle continues, looking directly at Dale as if recognizing the architect of his leader's downfall. Asked me what I thought about your offer. Said some of his men are tired of raiding when they could be trading. Said maybe there's something to be learned from people who negotiate with enemies instead of just eliminating them. Dale listens with the satisfaction of someone whose long-term strategy is beginning to bear fruit, but also with the sorrow of someone who understands the human cost of ideological conflict. The governor's paranoia isn't just political calculation. It's genuine fear that his worldview is being proven wrong by people who've chosen a different path. We can offer you sanctuary, Dale tells Merle, but we'll need to know that you understand what sanctuary means in our community. It means participating in democratic decision-making. It means following rules designed to protect everyone's welfare, not just your own. It means accepting that former enemies can become allies if they're willing to change. Merle nods slowly, and there's something in his expression that suggests the months in Woodbury have taught him lessons about leadership that he never learned in the military. Darrell always said you people were different, said you actually gave a damn about doing things right, not just getting them done. Figured it was worth finding out if he was correct. The reunion between the Dixon brothers provides a moment of human warmth that cuts through the growing tension, but it also brings intelligence about the governor's deteriorating mental state and increasingly desperate plans. According to Merle, the governor is preparing for an assault designed not just to defeat the prison community, but to prove that their approach is naive idealism that collapses under pressure. He's planning to hit you with everything he's got, Merle warns during a strategy session that includes the full prison council. Vehicles, heavy weapons, enough firepower to level half the prison. But here's the thing, he's having trouble getting his people to commit to full assault. Too many questions about why negotiation wasn't tried, why civilians couldn't just leave if they wanted to. The information allows them to prepare defenses that go beyond military tactics to include psychological warfare. They position speakers near the perimeter to broadcast their message of sanctuary to any Woodbury soldiers who might be having second thoughts. They prepare additional supplies to accommodate potential defectors. Most importantly, they prepare to demonstrate their principles under fire rather than abandoning them when threatened. The governor's assault, when it comes, arrives with the dawn on a Tuesday morning that starts with birdsong and ends with gunfire. But the attack unfolds differently than anyone anticipated, precisely because the prison community's reputation has preceded them. Martinez leads the first wave of vehicles toward the prison gates, but his heart isn't in the charge. Too many conversations with his men about alternatives to violence. Too many questions about why their leader won't consider diplomatic solutions. Too many doubts about whether conquest is the only path to security. When the shooting starts, it's Martinez who makes the first crucial decision. Instead of targeting the prison's defensive positions, he orders his men to aim over the heads of the defenders, creating the sound and fury of battle without the mass casualties the governor expects. "Warning shots," he tells his confused soldiers over the radio. "Let them know we're serious, but give them a chance to surrender with dignity." It's not the order the governor gave, but it's the order Martinez believes his men want to follow. And in that moment of battlefield decision-making, Dale's strategy achieves its ultimate vindication. The offer of an alternative approach to conflict has created enough doubt within the governor's forces to undermine the assault from within. The governor, watching from his command vehicle, recognizes immediately that his authority is crumbling. Not because of superior enemy firepower, but because his people have begun to question whether his way is the only way. In his rage and desperation, he makes a decision that will define him forever. He orders his remaining loyal soldiers to fire on Martinez's men. The battle that follows isn't between Woodbury and the prison community. It's between two visions of what Woodbury should become. Martinez and his supporters fighting for the right to choose cooperation over conquest, the governor and his loyalists fighting to preserve the autocratic system that gave them power and purpose. Dale, positioned in one of the prison's watchtowers to coordinate their defensive response, becomes an unintended casualty when the governor's forces target the tower with a rocket launcher. The explosion doesn't kill him, but it leaves him unconscious and bleeding, carried to safety by Carl and Randall, working together in a display of courage that owes everything to Dale's influence on their development. He's the reason any of this worked, Carl says, as Herschel works to stabilize Dale's injuries in the prison's makeshift medical bay. The reason we even tried talking instead of just fighting. We have to make sure he sees how this ends. The end, when it comes, is both more and less dramatic than traditional military victory. The governor retreats with the handful of soldiers still loyal to his vision, but he leaves behind a fractured community and a battlefield where former enemies work together to tend wounded and secure weapons. Martinez approaches the prison gates under a flag of truce, his uniform torn and his face grim, but his posture suggesting relief rather than defeat. Behind him, a convoy of Woodbury vehicles carries civilians who have chosen sanctuary over uncertainty, soldiers who have chosen cooperation over continued conflict. Governor's gone, Martinez reports to Rick and the hastily assembled prison council. Took his most loyal people and headed west, said he was going to find a community that appreciated strong leadership. Left the rest of us to figure out what comes next. What comes next is the practical work of integration, of turning ideology into daily routine. Some of the Woodbury refugees will stay at the prison, contributing their skills to the community Dale helped design. Others will return to Woodbury to rebuild it along more democratic lines, using the prison community as a model for cooperative governance. Andrea, finally free to choose between communities, spends the day moving between the prison and the departing Woodbury convoy, torn between the familiar and the possible. But it's her conversation with Dale, conducted while he recovers from his injuries, that helps her understand what choice she's really making. It's not about which place is safer, Dale tells her, his voice still weak but his eyes clear. It's about which place lets you be the person you want to become. Which place treats your values as resources rather than obstacles. By evening, Andrea has made her choice. She'll return to Woodbury, but as part of a delegation committed to establishing the kind of democratic governance that the prison community has proven is possible. Not conquest, but conversion. Not victory, but transformation. As night settles over the prison, the community Dale helped build gathers in the cafeteria for a meal that includes former enemies and new allies, people who hours ago were shooting at each other and now pass around canned goods and stories about what they hope to accomplish together. Dale, propped up in bed but insistent on attending, watches the scene with the satisfaction of someone whose longest gamble has finally paid off. The violence couldn't be completely avoided. It never can be in a world this broken. But it was limited, controlled, transformed from conquest into conversion by the simple recognition that people are capable of choosing cooperation if they're given genuine alternatives. "You think the governor will be back?" Carl asks, settling into a chair beside Dale's bed with a plate of food and the particular seriousness he reserves for the most important conversations. "Maybe," Dale admits. People don't usually give up their worldviews easily, especially when those worldviews have given them power. But if he does come back, he'll find something different than what he left, Communities that have learned they don't have to choose between safety and principles. People who know there's another way to organize society. Outside the prison walls, the Georgia night is filled with the sounds of people building something new from the ashes of what came before. Inside, in the warmth of the cafeteria where democracy has taken root and mercy has proven practical, Dale closes his eyes and allows himself to believe that the world might just be getting better instead of worse. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that his approach can survive and thrive. But tonight, surrounded by people who have chosen cooperation over conquest, he permits himself the luxury of hope. It's not much of a victory, maybe, but it's enough. For now, it's more than enough. Chapter 7. The Long Road to Terminus. The fall of the prison comes not with the governor's return, but with something more fundamental than personal vengeance. A massive Walker herd, driven south by wildfires that have been burning through northern Georgia for weeks. When the dead arrive, they come in numbers that no amount of defensive preparation could have anticipated, flowing over the walls like a dark tide that makes all their careful planning irrelevant. But Dale's influence shapes even this catastrophe. Instead of scattering in panic, the groups that form during the evacuation do so according to predetermined protocols that prioritize communication and eventual reunion. Instead of every person for themselves, it becomes an organized retreat with designated meeting points and shared objectives. Rick finds himself leading a group that includes Carl, Judith, and Michonne, moving south along the highways that have become the arteries of post-apocalyptic migration. But their progress is measured not just in miles covered, but in lives touched along the way. Dale's lessons about humanity being a choice rather than an accident have taken such deep root that they cannot pass by suffering without attempting to address it. 2 days into their journey, they encounter a family trapped in an overturned sedan, the vehicle surrounded by a handful of walkers that the trapped survivors lack the weapons or knowledge to dispatch. The old Rick, the pre-Dale Rick, might have calculated the risk and decided to move on, preserving his group's safety over the lives of strangers. This Rick stops the car and starts planning a rescue operation. "Dad," Carl says, and there's something in his voice that suggests he's about to echo his father's own pragmatic instincts. "We don't know these people. We don't know if they're worth the risk." But then Carl catches himself, and the moment that follows reveals how thoroughly Dale's influence has reshaped not just Rick's thinking, but the moral foundation of the next generation. The boy who might have grown up calculating human worth in terms of utility has instead learned to see rescue as responsibility rather than choice. "Actually," Carl continues, checking his weapons with the calm efficiency that combat training has taught him, "we don't get to decide if they're worth it. They're people. That makes them worth it." The rescue operation that follows is executed with the kind of tactical precision that months at the prison developed, but also with the careful attention to human dignity that Dale insisted was inseparable from effective leadership. They don't just extract the family, they take time to tend their injuries, share supplies, and explain the route to safety that other survivor groups have established. More importantly, they ask questions, not interrogation designed to expose threats, but the kind of genuine inquiry that Dale perfected, questions aimed at understanding who these people are and what they might contribute to the larger community of survivors that's slowly taking shape across the region. The family they rescue, a mother, father, and teenage daughter who have been surviving in suburban Atlanta since the outbreak began, brings news that reshapes Rick's understanding of how far their reputation has spread. People are talking about the prison community, about the group that integrated enemies instead of eliminating them, about the leaders who chose diplomacy over domination whenever possible. "We heard about you from some folks who came through our neighborhood last month," the father explains as they share a meal around a carefully concealed campfire. "Said there was a group near Macon that had figured out how to live with each other instead of just surviving each other. We were trying to get there when the fires started pushing all the dead south." The information creates a moment of profound recognition for Rick. The community they built at the prison wasn't just a local experiment. It was a model that other survivors have begun trying to replicate. Dale's vision of maintaining humanity through conscious choice has begun to spread beyond their immediate influence, carried by people who witnessed their approach and decided to try implementing it themselves. But the information also brings responsibility. If other communities are looking to them as an example, then how they conduct themselves on the road becomes more than just survival strategy. It becomes a demonstration of whether their principles can survive displacement and loss. 3 groups moving south toward the railroad sanctuary called Terminus, but their routes intersect with the journeys of dozens of other survivors, creating opportunities to demonstrate what they learned during their months at the prison. Darrell and Carol, traveling together with 2 of the former Woodbury residents, establish impromptu way stations where separated groups can leave messages for each other. Glenn and Maggie, moving with Herschel and Beth, create informal medical stations where their veterinary supplies and knowledge can help injured survivors. Most significantly, Dale and Andrea, traveling with several of the former prison inmates, establish what amounts to a mobile diplomatic mission, mediating disputes between survivor groups and helping to establish the kind of cooperative, resource-sharing agreements that made the prison community successful. "The thing about displacement," Dale explains to Rick during one of their evening radio check-ins, his voice carrying across the static-filled airwaves that connect their scattered groups, "is that it forces you to discover whether your principles were tied to a particular place or whether they travel with you wherever you go. The test of that traveling principle comes when Carl's group encounters a situation that would have been unthinkable during their early days on the road. A conflict between 2 survivor groups over access to a medical supply cache that both communities desperately need. The old approach would have been to let them fight it out or to pick the side most likely to win. But Carl, now 14, and carrying both weapons and authority that would have been unimaginable to his younger self, instead proposes the kind of diplomatic solution that Dale would have suggested. "What if we help you organize a sharing system?" he suggests to the leaders of both groups, his voice carrying the particular gravity that comes from having lived through the consequences of both mercy and violence. Not winner-take-all, but an arrangement where everyone gets what they need most urgently, and we establish protocols for future supply sharing. The negotiations that follow reveal how much the prison community's reputation has preceded them. Both groups know about the diplomatic successes at the prison, about the integration of former enemies, about the democratic governance structures that manage to maintain both security and individual rights. More importantly, they want to learn how to replicate those successes in their own communities. The sharing agreement they establish becomes a template that gets passed from group to group along the survivor networks that have developed throughout northern Georgia. Not just practical resource management, but a philosophical framework for approaching intergroup conflict as a problem to be solved cooperatively, rather than a zero-sum competition to be won. By the time the scattered elements of their community begin to reconverge as they approach Terminus, they've created something unprecedented in the post-apocalyptic landscape. A loose confederation of survivor communities, connected not by conquest or domination, but by shared commitment to the principles that Dale articulated, and they've all helped refine. But Terminus itself presents challenges that test those principles in ways none of them anticipated. The signs promise sanctuary, safety, community for all who arrive. The reality they discover is more complex, a place that offers genuine safety, but under governance structures that echo the autocratic control they rejected at Woodbury. Something's not right about this place, Michonne observes as they conduct their initial reconnaissance, her instincts for danger honed by months on the road. Too organized, too controlled, like they figured out how to make the trains run on time, but forgot to ask whether people want to be passengers. Dale's influence shapes their approach to this new challenge, just as it shaped their approach to all the others. Instead of immediate confrontation or simple acceptance, they choose careful observation and gradual engagement. They want to understand not just what Terminus offers, but what it costs and who pays the price. The conversations Rick has with the Terminus leadership reveal the fundamental tension between safety and freedom that has defined every major conflict since the outbreak began. Terminus offers genuine security, reliable food distribution, protection from both walkers and human threats. But it offers these benefits in exchange for the kind of individual autonomy and democratic participation that the prison community considered non-negotiable. People want to be safe, explains Gareth, the young man who seems to serve as Terminus's primary spokesperson. They want to know that someone competent is making the hard decisions, that they don't have to carry the weight of group survival on their own shoulders. Democracy is a luxury that most communities can't afford. It's exactly the argument that the governor might have made, dressed in more reasonable language and backed by more compelling evidence. Terminus works by most measures that matter in the post-apocalyptic world. People are fed, protected, housed, given meaningful work and social structure, but they're not given meaningful choices about the fundamental direction of their community, and that absence of choice makes all the other benefits feel conditional rather than secure. The question, Dale says during one of their evening planning sessions, conducted in the woods outside Terminus, while they decide whether to stay or continue moving, is whether we can find a third option, a way to have both safety and freedom, both effective leadership and democratic participation. It's the kind of question that has defined their journey since leaving Herschel's farm, and the answer they develop will shape not just their own future, but the future of every community that looks to them as a model for post-apocalyptic civilization. Tomorrow will bring new conversations with the Terminus leadership, new opportunities to demonstrate that their approach to community building can work even in the most challenging circumstances. But tonight, gathered around their concealed campfire with the railroad sanctuary glowing in the distance, they allow themselves to believe that the long road from the prison has brought them somewhere worth being. The principles Dale helped them articulate haven't just survived displacement and loss. They've grown stronger through the testing, more nuanced through application, more compelling through demonstration. And if Terminus can learn from their example, the way so many other communities have learned, then maybe the post-apocalyptic world can become something better than just an endless struggle for survival. Maybe it can become a place where people choose cooperation over conquest, where community is built through invitation rather than coercion, where the future is something to be created together rather than simply endured alone. It's not much of a victory, maybe, but it's a beginning. And for people who have learned to measure progress in hope preserved rather than territory conquered, a beginning is everything. Chapter 8. The Sanctuary of Lies. The arrival at Terminus happens differently than anyone anticipated because Rick's group doesn't arrive alone. The convoy that approaches the railroad sanctuary includes not just the scattered members of their prison community, but representatives from 6 other survivor groups they've encountered and assisted during their journey south. What should have been a desperate search for refuge becomes something approaching a diplomatic mission. Gareth meets them at the gates with the practiced smile that has welcomed thousands of survivors to Terminus, but there's something different in his expression when he recognizes who they are. The prison group's reputation has preceded them even here, carried by the network of survivor communities that stretches across northern Georgia, like an invisible web of shared stories and mutual aid. "You're Rick Grimes," Gareth says, and it's not a question. "From the prison community near Macon. People have been talking about your group for months, about the way you handle conflicts, the way you integrate new people instead of just using them." Dale steps forward with the diplomatic instincts that have served them well throughout their journey, but there's something in Gareth's tone that makes him pause. Not hostility, exactly, but a kind of wary calculation that suggests Terminus leadership has been thinking about the prison group's approach for longer than this initial meeting would suggest. "We're looking for a place where people can rebuild," Dale says carefully, his voice carrying the particular warmth he reserves for first contacts that might determine life or death for everyone involved. Somewhere that people can contribute their skills, share their knowledge, work together toward something better than just survival. "That's exactly what we offer," Gareth replies, but his smile doesn't reach his eyes. "Come in, get settled, meet some of our people. We'll talk about long-term arrangements once you've had a chance to see what we've built here." The initial tour of Terminus reveals a community that seems almost too good to be true. Clean facilities, abundant food, people engaged in meaningful work rather than just subsistence survival. Gardens that suggest long-term planning, workshops where people repair and create rather than just scavenge and consume. It's everything the prison community aspired to become, but achieved on a scale that dwarfs what they accomplished. But Dale's instincts, honed by years of reading between the lines of human behavior, detect something wrong beneath the surface prosperity. Conversations that stop when outsiders approach, work assignments that seem designed to separate new arrivals from each other rather than integrate them into existing teams. A subtle but persistent emphasis on the authority of Terminus leadership that echoes the autocratic structure they rejected at Woodbury. "It's impressive," Dale tells Rick during one of their carefully private conversations in the barracks where new arrivals are housed. But there's something performative about it. Like they're showing us what they think we want to see, rather than what actually is. Rick nods, his own law enforcement instincts picking up on the same subtle wrongness. Too many guards for a peaceful community, too much control over movement and communication. And have you noticed that we haven't seen any of the leadership structures they claim to have? No councils, no democratic decision-making, no input from regular community members on policy. The first crack in Terminus's facade comes not from investigation or confrontation, but from Dale's particular gift for encouraging people to share their stories. A woman named Mary, who oversees the community's food preparation, finds herself drawn into conversation with the older man whose reputation for listening has become legendary among survivor communities. "You people really did it, didn't you?" Mary asks during one of Dale's visits to the communal kitchen, her voice carrying something that might be wonder or might be sadness. "Built a community where people actually get to choose how they live, where leadership serves the community instead of the other way around." "We tried," Dale says, settling into the rhythm of conversation that has opened so many doors during their journey. "Not perfectly, not without mistakes, but we tried to create something worth preserving instead of just something worth surviving. What follows is a conversation that will haunt Dale for the rest of his life. Mary tells him about Terminus's early days, about the idealistic community they tried to build in the immediate aftermath of the outbreak, about democratic governance and shared resources and collective decision-making that echoes everything the prison community achieved, and about the raiders who destroyed it all. "We tried to be good," Mary says, her voice breaking on words that have been held inside for too long. "We tried to help everyone who came to us, to share what we had, to build something decent. And the people we helped turned on us, took everything, killed half our people, left the rest of us to starve. The trauma runs deeper than simple betrayal. The people who attacked Terminus weren't random raiders. They were survivors that the community had taken in, fed, housed, integrated into their society. People who had lived among them for months, who had been given positions of trust and responsibility, who had been treated as family. That's when we learned," Mary continues, tears now flowing freely down her face. "That's when we understood that mercy is just another word for weakness. That kindness is just a luxury that gets people killed. That the only way to survive is to make sure everyone else is more afraid of you than you are of them." Dale feels something break inside his chest as the implications of Mary's confession settle into place. The abundance of Terminus, the well-maintained facilities, the apparent prosperity. It's all built on the systematic exploitation of people who come seeking exactly what the prison community offered. Hope, cooperation, mutual aid. "The people who arrive here," Dale says, and his voice is smaller than it's been in years. "What happens to them?" Mary looks at him with the expression of someone who has been waiting years for someone to ask that question. Someone who might understand the weight of what they've become. "We give them what they gave us. We make them understand what it feels like to trust someone who's planning to destroy you." The revelation hits Dale like a physical blow, not just because of its moral implications, but because of how completely it inverts everything he's spent years trying to prove. Terminus isn't just another failed community or autocratic settlement. It's the dark mirror image of everything the prison community represented. People who started with exactly the same values, exactly the same hopes, exactly the same commitment to human decency, driven by trauma and betrayal into becoming the very evil they originally sought to resist. But even as the horror of Terminus's true nature becomes clear, Dale's commitment to understanding, rather than simply judging, creates an opportunity that wouldn't exist under other circumstances. Mary isn't just confessing, she's asking for help, for some way to escape the cycle of violence that has defined her community for years. "Some of us remember," she whispers, looking around the kitchen with the paranoid awareness of someone who knows the consequences of being overheard. "Some of us want to find another way. But Gareth and the others, they've convinced themselves that this is justice. That what we do to people is what people did to us. They can't see that we've become the very thing we were trying to protect ourselves from." The information creates an impossible moral calculus for Rick and Dale and their community. They've discovered a group of people who have crossed perhaps the most fundamental line of human civilization, who have built their survival on the systematic murder and consumption of fellow survivors. By any reasonable standard, these people represent an existential threat that must be eliminated for the safety of everyone else. But they've also discovered that some members of Terminus are prisoners of their own community's decisions, people who want to escape but lack the power or opportunity to do so. People who started with the same values the prison community embraced, who were broken by circumstances that could have destroyed any community. "We have to get our people out," Rick says during an emergency council meeting conducted in whispered conversations throughout the Terminus compound. But we also have to figure out what to do about the people here who want out but can't leave. It's Carl who suggests the approach that will define their escape strategy. Not the frontal assault that might have characterized their earlier responses to threats, but a more complex operation designed to extract not just their own people, but any Terminus residents who can be turned against their leadership. We divide them, Carl says with the tactical thinking that years of Dale's influence has refined into strategic wisdom. We show the people who still have consciences that there's another way. We prove that cooperation is still possible, even after betrayal. We give them a chance to choose who they want to be, instead of just accepting who they've become. The escape from Terminus becomes something unprecedented in post-apocalyptic survival, a rescue operation that includes rescuing some members of the hostile community from themselves. Working with Mary and others who retain some memory of their original values, they create an internal revolution that tears apart Terminus's facade of unity. When the shooting starts, it's not just the prison community against Terminus leadership. It's a civil war between two visions of what Terminus should become. Gareth and his loyalists fighting to preserve the system that has kept them alive through systematic evil. Mary and her allies fighting for the chance to reclaim something resembling their original humanity. The battle is brief but decisive, ending not just with the escape of the prison community, but with the collapse of Terminus as a functioning entity. Those who survive face a choice between following Gareth into deeper brutality or joining the prisoner community's network of cooperative survivor settlements. Some choose continuing violence, but others, broken people who thought redemption was impossible, choose the harder path of trying to rebuild not just their community, but their humanity. Dale, exhausted and traumatized by the encounter with evil that started from good intentions, finds himself comforting Mary as they prepare to leave the ruins of Terminus behind. The woman who helped design their escape sits beside him, weeping for the people she became complicit in killing, for the ideals she thought were permanently lost, for the possibility of redemption she never believed she would be offered. "You don't have to forgive us," she tells Dale, her voice raw with years of suppressed guilt and grief. "You don't even have to trust us. But if you'll let us try, if you'll give us a chance to prove that people can change, even after they've done unforgivable things, we'll spend the rest of our lives trying to make up for what we became." Dale looks at her with the expression of someone whose worldview has been tested to its absolute limits, and somehow survived intact. Not unchanged, the encounter with Terminus has taught him that good intentions aren't enough, that trauma can destroy even the most committed communities, that the line between civilization and barbarism is thinner than he ever imagined. But not broken. Because if people can fall as far as Terminus fell, and still retain some spark of their original humanity, then maybe redemption really is possible for anyone willing to do the work of reclaiming it. "We'll try," he says, and the words carry the weight of every difficult decision they've made since sparing Randall changed the trajectory of their entire journey. All of us together. That's what trying to stay human means. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that mercy and justice can coexist even in the face of unimaginable evil. But tonight, as they prepare to leave Terminus and its horrors behind, they carry with them not just survivors from their own community, but refugees from the darkness itself, people who chose to risk everything for the chance to become better than what trauma made them. It's the hardest kind of victory, but it's the only kind that really matters. Chapter 9. After the Fire. The campfire burns low in the Georgia woods, its light casting shifting shadows on faces that have seen too much in too short a time. 3 days since the escape from Terminus, and the smoke still seems to cling to everything. Their clothes, their hair, their memories of what people can become when mercy is mistaken for weakness and survival becomes more important than humanity. Dale sits apart from the main group, staring into flames that remind him of things he wishes he could forget. Mary sits nearby, wrapped in a blanket that can't seem to warm the chill that goes deeper than skin, deeper than bone, into whatever part of the soul keeps track of lines crossed and uncrossed. Between them stretches the weight of questions that have no easy answers, conversations that need to happen but might break something essential in the having. I keep thinking about the moment when we changed, Mary says, her voice barely audible above the crackling of burning wood. When we went from being people who fed strangers to people who fed on them. It wasn't sudden. It was gradual, like water wearing away stone, until there's nothing left but the shape of what used to be there. Dale listens with the attention he's always given to people trying to make sense of impossible circumstances. But there's something different in his posture tonight. A brittleness that wasn't there before Terminus. A sense that the philosophical framework he's spent years building might not be strong enough to bear the weight of what he's learned about human nature's capacity for self-destruction. The worst part, Mary continues, is that every step felt justified at the time. Every compromise seemed reasonable. We told ourselves we were protecting the innocent, preserving the good, ensuring that never again would kind people be destroyed by their kindness. We became monsters one small decision at a time, each one seeming necessary and rational and moral. The words hit Dale like physical blows, not because they're cruel, but because they're true. The path from the prison community's humanitarian ideals to Terminus's systematic evil isn't as long as he'd thought. The difference between compassion and complicity, between mercy and naivety, between wisdom and foolishness, these distinctions that seemed clear in the abstract become muddy when filtered through desperation and trauma and the daily compromise that survival demands. Carl joins them at the fire, moving with the quiet consideration that has replaced his childhood restlessness. At 15, he's lived through enough philosophical tests to understand that this conversation isn't academic. It's about who they are and who they're going to become in a world that seems designed to destroy everything decent about human nature. You're thinking about giving up, Carl says. And it's not a question. He's been watching Dale for 3 days, seeing the way the older man's certainty has cracked under the weight of witnessing evil that started from good intentions. You're wondering if trying to stay human is worth it, if the effort can be turned against you. Dale looks at the boy who has become a young man under his influence, whose moral development has been shaped by principles that feel less secure now than they did before Terminus. The responsibility is crushing, knowing that his choices about how to respond to this crisis will shape not just his own future, but the future of everyone who has learned to look to him for moral guidance. I'm wondering if I've been naive, Dale admits, and the words taste like ash in his mouth. If the mercy I've advocated for has put people in danger, if the principles I've insisted on have made us vulnerable to exactly the kind of evil we encountered at Terminus. Carl considers this with the seriousness he brings to all philosophical questions, but there's something in his expression that suggests he's been thinking about this problem longer than Dale realizes. The conversation that follows will reshape both their understanding of what it means to maintain humanity in an inhuman world. The people at Terminus made a choice, Carl says, his voice carrying authority that comes from experience rather than age. They chose to let their trauma define them. They chose to become the thing they were afraid of, rather than figuring out how to fight it. That's not what we did. That's not what we're doing. But the result was the same, Dale argues, his voice heavy with the weight of self-doubt. Good intentions led to evil outcomes. Mercy became weakness. Compassion became complicity. No, Carl says, and there's steel in his voice that echoes his father, but wisdom that belongs entirely to himself. Mercy didn't become weakness. They abandoned mercy and called it strength. There's a difference between learning from trauma and being destroyed by it, between adapting your methods and abandoning your principles. The distinction Carl draws cuts through Dale's crisis of faith like a blade through fog, revealing truths that were there all along, but obscured by the horror of what they witnessed. The people at Terminus didn't represent the inevitable outcome of mercy. They represented what happens when mercy is abandoned in favor of expediency, when principles are sacrificed for survival, when the means become more important than the ends. Rick joins the conversation, drawn by the sound of voices grappling with questions that keep him awake at night. The months since leaving the prison have aged him in ways that go beyond physical appearance, carving lines of responsibility and wisdom and hard-won understanding into features that once carried only determination. Dale's right that we can't be naive, Rick says, settling beside the fire with the careful movements of someone whose body carries too many old injuries. But Carl's right that we can't let fear make our choices for us. The question isn't whether mercy is dangerous. It is dangerous. The question is whether the alternative is worse. What follows is the deepest philosophical conversation any of them has had since the outbreak began, a careful examination of how their principles must evolve to survive contact with evil that they never imagined possible. Not abandoning their humanitarian approach, but refining it, strengthening it, making it robust enough to function in a world where good intentions can lead to monstrous outcomes. We learned something important at Terminus, Rick continues, his voice carrying the particular gravity he reserves for the most crucial decisions. We learned that mercy without wisdom is dangerous, but we also learned that our approach can reach people even after they've fallen farther than we thought possible. Mary and the others who chose to come with us, they're proof that redemption is possible even for people who've done unforgivable things. Dale looks around the circle of firelight at faces that have been shaped by years of choosing cooperation over conflict, mercy over vengeance, hope over despair. Mary, whose hands prepared food for unsuspecting victims, but who risked everything to help them escape. Carl, who learned to see rescue as responsibility rather than choice. Rick, whose leadership has evolved to balance compassion with pragmatism in ways that would have been unimaginable during their early days on the road. Maybe the lesson isn't that mercy is naive, Dale says slowly, his voice gaining strength as the conversation helps him rebuild his philosophical foundation on firmer ground. Maybe the lesson is that mercy without accountability is naive, that compassion without consequences is dangerous, that we can be kind without being weak, merciful without being foolish. The distinction feels crucial, even revolutionary. Their approach doesn't need to be abandoned. It needs to be matured, refined, evolved to account for the complexity of human nature and the reality of evil that can emerge from good intentions. They can maintain their commitment to redemption while acknowledging that not everyone wants to be redeemed. They can offer mercy while insisting on justice. They can choose compassion while maintaining the strength to defend it against those who would exploit it. Over the following days, as they work to integrate the Terminus refugees into their larger community of survivors, The practical application of these refined principles begins to take shape. Mary and the others who chose redemption aren't simply forgiven and forgotten. They're given opportunities to prove their commitment to change through service to the community they helped restore. The work is hard, often painful, sometimes dangerous. Some of the Terminus refugees struggle with guilt so profound that it threatens to destroy them even after their rescue. Others find that the habits of mind and heart that sustained them through their darkest period resist the kind of fundamental change that true redemption requires. But some succeed. Some find ways to transform their knowledge of evil into wisdom about how to prevent it, their experience with moral failure into commitment to moral growth, their understanding of how good people can become monsters into dedication to ensuring it never happens again. Beth works with Mary to establish food distribution protocols that ensure no community member ever feels desperate enough to consider taking what belongs to others. Herschel draws on his medical experience to help the former Terminus residents process trauma that goes deeper than physical injury. Even Shane, still recovering from his own confrontation with moral failure, finds ways to contribute to the healing process that helps former enemies become allies. The decision to establish their own sanctuary emerges naturally from these experiences of healing and integration. Not just a place where people can survive, but a place where they can actively choose to become better than what trauma and desperation and fear might make them. A community explicitly committed to proving that Terminus's path wasn't inevitable, that mercy and justice can coexist, that people can choose cooperation over conquest even after experiencing the worst that human nature can produce. "We'll call it Haven," Dale suggests during one of their evening planning sessions, his voice carrying hope that has been tested, but not broken, by their encounter with darkness. Not because it's perfectly safe, nowhere can be perfectly safe in this world, but because it's a place where people can choose to be safe for each other, where being human is treated as an achievement rather than an accident. The name resonates through their expanding network of survivor communities, carried by people who have witnessed their approach to conflict resolution and community building. Within weeks, they're receiving visitors from groups throughout the region who want to learn how to implement similar principles in their own settlements. But more importantly, they're receiving refugees from communities that have followed Terminus's path. People who are desperate to escape the cycles of violence and exploitation that trauma and fear have created. People who need to see that another way is possible, that redemption is available even to those who thought they were beyond saving. As autumn settles over the Georgia countryside, Haven grows from an idea into a physical reality. Not just buildings and walls and defensive positions, but a functioning demonstration of how communities can choose to organize around hope rather than fear, cooperation rather than domination, mercy rather than vengeance. Dale watches from the porch of the council building as children play in gardens that former enemies helped plant, as people who once shot at each other work together to repair vehicles and tend livestock and plan for a future that seems not just possible but probable. The encounter with Terminus didn't destroy his faith in human nature. It refined it, strengthened it, taught him that mercy is not the absence of justice, but its fulfillment. That compassion is not the opposite of strength, but its highest expression. That people can choose to be better than what circumstances make them, even after they've fallen farther than anyone thought possible. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that their approach can survive and thrive in a world that seems designed to destroy everything decent about human civilization. But tonight, as children laugh and former enemies share meals and people who thought redemption was impossible work together to build something worth preserving, Dale allows himself to believe that the future might be brighter than the past. It's not much of a victory, maybe, but it's the only victory that really matters, the victory of choosing to remain human when everything else seems to be choosing the opposite. And for now, that's enough. More than enough. Chapter 10. The New Alexandria. The gates of Alexandria open. Not with the wariness that has characterized most first encounters in the post-apocalyptic world, but with something approaching ceremony. Aaron and Eric stand beside Deanna Monroe, Alexandria's leader, all three wearing expressions that suggest this meeting has been anticipated for longer than the usual few days of scouting and evaluation. "Rick Grimes," Deanna says, and her voice carries the particular warmth reserved for meeting someone whose reputation has preceded them by months rather than miles. The man who spared Randall, the leader who negotiated with prisoners instead of eliminating them, the group that turned enemies into allies at Woodbury and gave former cannibals a chance at redemption after Terminus. Dale steps forward with the diplomatic instincts that have served them well throughout their journey, but there's satisfaction in his bearing that suggests this reception is exactly what he hoped for when they first decided to approach Alexandria. The network of survivor communities they've helped establish has created something unprecedented, a reputation that opens doors rather than closing them, that generates trust rather than suspicion. "We're looking for a place to contribute," Dale says, his voice carrying the authority that comes from years of proving that humanitarian principles can coexist with practical necessity. Not just somewhere to survive, but somewhere to build something that justifies the survival. The conversations that follow over the next several days reveal how thoroughly their approach to community building has influenced the broader survivor landscape. Alexandria's residents have heard stories about Haven, about the prisoner community's approach to conflict resolution, about the network of cooperative settlements that stretches throughout northern Georgia and beyond. More importantly, they've been implementing versions of those approaches in their own community, adapting the prison group's methods to Alexandria's particular circumstances and needs. Democratic decision-making processes that include all adult residents, resource-sharing agreements with neighboring communities, conflict resolution protocols that prioritize restoration over punishment. "We've been trying to figure out how to do what you people did," Deanna explains during one of their integration meetings, conducted in Alexandria's community center with representatives from both groups participating. How to maintain safety while preserving freedom. How to have effective leadership without autocratic control. How to stay human while staying alive. Rick listens with the expression of someone whose worldview has been validated in ways he never expected, but there's also humility in his posture that reflects hard-won understanding of how difficult the balance really is. The months since leaving the prison have taught him that their approach isn't a simple formula that can be implemented anywhere. It's a philosophy that requires constant adaptation, refinement, and commitment to principles that are easier to articulate than to live. "It's not about having the right answers," Rick says, settling into the kind of thoughtful conversation that has become his preferred method of leadership. "It's about asking the right questions, about treating every decision as an opportunity to prove that cooperation works better than competition, that mercy is more practical than vengeance, that people can choose to be better than what circumstances force them to become." The integration process that follows demonstrates how much their community has learned about bringing together different groups with different histories, different traumas, different approaches to survival. Instead of the assimilation model that would have characterized their early days, newcomers adapting to established customs, they implement something more collaborative, more democratic, more respectful of what each group brings to the relationship. Alexandria's residents share their knowledge of sustainable agriculture, renewable energy systems, and long-term infrastructure maintenance. The prison community shares their experience with conflict resolution, democratic governance, and the psychological work of helping traumatized people rebuild their capacity for trust and cooperation. But more importantly, they share their stories, not just the tactical details of how they survived particular threats, but the moral and philosophical journey that transformed them from a desperate collection of refugees into a functioning model of post-apocalyptic civilization. Carl plays a crucial role in this storytelling process, his voice carrying particular authority because he represents the generation that has grown up during the apocalypse, that has learned to navigate moral complexity as a basic life skill rather than an abstract philosophical exercise. The thing about mercy, Carl explains to a group of Alexandria teenagers during one of their evening gatherings, is that it's not about being soft or naive. It's about being strong enough to choose what kind of person you want to be, instead of just letting circumstances decide for you. The teenagers listen with the attention they might have given to survival instruction, because in this world, moral development is survival instruction. The ability to build trust, resolve conflicts, and create sustainable communities isn't just nice to have, it's essential for long-term survival in a world where human cooperation is often the difference between thriving and simply enduring. Dale's influence on Alexandria's governance structures proves particularly transformative. Working with Deanna and the existing council, he helps establish formal protocols for the kind of democratic decision-making that the prison community perfected over years of trial and error. Not just voting on major policy decisions, but creating space for dissent, ensuring that minority voices are heard, establishing mechanisms for changing course when policies prove ineffective or harmful. The kind of robust democratic processes that can survive disagreement, conflict, and the inevitable mistakes that every community makes while learning how to function. Democracy isn't just about majority rule, Dale explains during one of their governance workshops, his voice carrying the wisdom that comes from years of practical experience with community building. It's about creating systems that allow people to disagree without destroying each other, to change their minds without losing face, to make mistakes without abandoning the effort to do better. The practical application of these principles becomes visible in how Alexandria handles its first major challenge after the prison community's arrival, a conflict with a neighboring community over water rights that threatens to escalate into the kind of violence that has characterized so many intergroup disputes in the post-apocalyptic world. The old Alexandria might have fortified their borders and prepared for siege. The new Alexandria, influenced by the prison community's reputation for diplomatic solutions, instead sends a delegation to negotiate a resource-sharing agreement that benefits both communities. Rick leads the delegation, but his approach reflects everything he's learned from Dale about treating conflicts as problems to be solved cooperatively rather than competitions to be won. The negotiations take weeks, require multiple rounds of discussion and compromise, and ultimately result in an agreement that not only resolves the immediate water dispute, but establishes a framework for ongoing cooperation on issues ranging from trade to mutual defense to coordinated response to Walker herds. "You really think this can work long-term?" asks Spencer Monroe, Deanna's son, who has watched the negotiations with the skepticism of someone who has seen too many hopeful initiatives fail under pressure. All this cooperation and resource sharing and democratic decision-making? When things get really desperate, when people are scared enough, won't they revert to the old patterns of taking what they need and eliminating anyone who stands in their way? It's Carl who answers, his voice carrying conviction that comes from having lived through the testing of these principles under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. Maybe some people will, Carl says. Maybe some communities will choose to go back to the old ways when things get hard. But the question isn't whether everyone will choose cooperation. It's whether enough people will choose it to make a difference. Whether the communities that choose mercy and justice can support each other enough to survive and thrive, while the communities that choose violence and exploitation destroy themselves. The expansion of Alexandria's walls, when it happens, represents more than just physical growth. It's a demonstration of the prison community's influence on how Alexandria thinks about inclusion, about who belongs inside the boundaries of safety and security. Instead of expanding just to accommodate their own growth, Alexandria expands to include several smaller survivor settlements that have been struggling to maintain independence in an increasingly dangerous landscape. Not conquest or absorption, but voluntary integration based on shared commitment to the principles that the prison community helped articulate and refine. The process isn't without challenges. Some of the smaller communities bring their own traumas, their own conflicts, their own approaches to survival that don't always align with Alexandria's evolving culture. There are tensions, disagreements, moments when the whole project seems too ambitious to sustain. But there are also breakthrough moments when former enemies become allies, when people who thought cooperation was impossible discover that they can trust each other, when communities that expected to compete for scarce resources instead find ways to share and multiply those resources through collaborative effort. Dale watches these transformations with the satisfaction of someone whose longest gamble has finally paid off, but also with the humility of someone who understands that the work of building sustainable community is never finished, never secure, never guaranteed to last beyond the next crisis or challenge. "We've proved that it's possible," he says to Rick during one of their evening walks around Alexandria's expanded perimeter, his voice carrying both pride and recognition of how much work remains to be done. "We've proved that people can choose cooperation over competition, that mercy can coexist with strength, that democracy can function even in desperate circumstances. But proving it's possible and making it permanent are different things," Rick replies, his own voice reflecting the weight of responsibility for maintaining what they've built while continuing to expand its influence. Every generation has to choose these principles for themselves. Every community has to decide whether they want to be part of building something better or just focused on surviving whatever comes next. As winter settles over Virginia, Alexandria has become something unprecedented in the post-apocalyptic world, not just a safe haven, but a functioning demonstration of how communities can organize around hope rather than fear, inclusion rather than exclusion, cooperation rather than domination. The children who play in Alexandria's expanded gardens have grown up in a world shaped by Dale's vision, where mercy is treated as strength rather than weakness, where former enemies can become family members, where the future is something to be built together rather than simply endured in isolation. Dale's legacy isn't just philosophical, it's institutional, embedded in governance structures and conflict resolution protocols and resource-sharing agreements that have proven robust enough to survive disagreement, flexible enough to adapt to changing circumstances, and compelling enough to inspire replication by other communities throughout the region. The journey from sparing Randall in a barn on Herschel's farm to building a network of cooperative communities centered on Alexandria has taken years, cost lives, required compromises and sacrifices that no one could have anticipated. But it has also proved that the apocalypse doesn't have to be the end of civilization. It can be the beginning of a better kind of civilization, one consciously designed around human dignity rather than simple survival. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that their approach can continue to evolve and adapt. But tonight, as families gather for dinner in homes that were once strangers' houses, as former enemies share stories and former prisoners teach children, as democracy functions and mercy prevails and hope seems not just possible but probable, Dale allows himself to believe that the future might be brighter than anyone dared to imagine. It's not the victory anyone expected when they first chose to spare rather than execute, to include rather than exclude, to cooperate rather than dominate. But it's the victory that matters most, the victory of proving that people can choose to be better than what circumstances force them to become. And in a world that has forgotten what better looks like, that memory might be the most precious thing they can preserve. Chapter 11. The Wisdom of the Elder. The grey in Dale Horvath's beard has spread like winter frost, marking the passage of years that have transformed the post-apocalyptic landscape from a collection of isolated survivor settlements into something approaching a functioning civilization. At 73, he moves more slowly than he once did, his body carrying the accumulated weight of decisions that shaped the fate of thousands of people across 3 states. But his eyes still hold the particular intensity that comes from someone who has spent decades watching human nature reveal itself under extreme pressure, who has learned to see patterns in the chaos that others miss, who understands that the work of building a better world is never finished, but always worth continuing. The Leadership Council meeting, taking place in Alexandria's expanded community center, would have been unimaginable during their early days on the road. Representatives from 17 different communities spread across the southeastern United States, all connected by trade agreements and mutual defense pacts, and shared commitment to the principles that emerged from a decision to spare rather than execute a frightened young man named Randall. The question before us today, Dale says, his voice still carrying authority despite its increased frailness, isn't whether we can continue to grow this network of cooperative communities. We've proven that's possible. The question is whether we can institutionalize the lessons we've learned so thoroughly that they survive even when the people who learned them are no longer here to teach them. The representatives listen with the attention they might have given to strategic planning sessions, because in this world, moral philosophy is strategic planning. The ability to maintain cooperation across communities, to resolve conflicts without violence, to integrate new groups without losing essential character. These aren't abstract ideals, but practical skills that determine whether their emerging civilization thrives or collapses. Carl Grimes sits at Dale's right hand, no longer the frightened boy who once urged his father to execute a prisoner, but a 23-year-old man whose entire worldview has been shaped by the recognition that mercy is not weakness, but the foundation of sustainable strength. His presence at Dale's side represents not just personal growth, but generational continuity, proof that the principles they've fought to establish can be passed down rather than dying with the people who developed them. I've been thinking about something Dale said to me when I was 12, Carl says, his voice carrying the particular gravity that comes from someone who has lived through the consequences of choosing compassion over cruelty. He told me that the world we knew was gone, but keeping our humanity was a choice. I didn't understand then that he wasn't talking about some abstract, philosophical principle. He was talking about practical survival skills that would determine whether we built something worth preserving or just managed to stay alive while everything decent about human civilization died around us. Rick watches his son with the pride that comes from seeing your child become not just a competent adult, but a wise one, someone whose character has been forged through testing rather than just inherited through genetics. The man Rick has become would be unrecognizable to his younger self, still capable of making hard decisions, still willing to use violence when necessary, but guided by principles that transform pragmatism from simple expedience into something approaching wisdom. Dale's influence on my development as a leader can't be separated from my development as a father, Rick says, looking around the council chamber at faces that represent communities throughout the region. Learning to balance mercy with justice, cooperation with security, hope with realism, these weren't just political skills, but parenting skills. The kind of world we wanted to raise our children in became inseparable from the kind of communities we wanted to build. The practical applications of these principles have evolved far beyond what anyone could have imagined during their early experiments at the prison. Trade networks that distribute resources based on need rather than just ability to pay. Conflict resolution protocols that have prevented dozens of potential wars between communities. Integration processes that have successfully absorbed everyone from former bandits to displaced government officials to survivors of failed utopian experiments. Most impressively, they've developed educational systems that teach the next generation not just practical survival skills, but the moral reasoning necessary to maintain cooperation, even under pressure. Children who have grown up in this network of communities think about intergroup conflict differently than their parents did, approaching disagreements as problems to be solved rather than competitions to be won. The Whisperer crisis taught us something important about how far we've come, says Maria Gonzalez, representative from the Savannah Coalition and one of the most respected leaders in their network. When those people started infiltrating our communities, started trying to break down the barriers between the living and the dead, our response wasn't to retreat into isolation or launch preemptive strikes. We developed coordinated intelligence gathering, shared resources for defense, worked together to understand what had driven them to such extremes. The Whisperer conflict had indeed tested their principles in ways that previous challenges hadn't. Facing people who had abandoned not just civilization, but humanity itself, who wore the skins of the dead and rejected every social bond that makes cooperative living possible, the network of communities had been forced to confront the ultimate question of whether their humanitarian approach could function against enemies who rejected the very concept of humanity. The answer had been complex, requiring innovations in both tactics and ethics that would have been impossible during their earlier days. They'd developed new approaches to intelligence gathering that respected human dignity while acknowledging genuine threats. They'd created intervention protocols designed to reach Whisperers who might be amenable to reintegration while protecting communities from those who weren't. Most importantly, they'd learned to distinguish between people who had temporarily lost their way and people who had chosen to embrace a philosophy fundamentally incompatible with civilized life. It was a harder distinction than simple friend versus enemy, requiring the kind of nuanced moral reasoning that Dale had always insisted was essential for sustainable leadership. Some of the Whisperers we encountered were people who had been broken by trauma, who had given up on human connection because they'd been betrayed too many times. Carl continues, his voice carrying the weight of personal experience with these encounters. Others had genuinely convinced themselves that civilization was a mistake, that cooperation was weakness, that the only honest response to the apocalypse was to embrace the chaos completely, learning to tell the difference, learning when to extend mercy and when to defend against genuine threats that required everything Dale taught us about reading human nature and understanding motivation. The educational implications of these experiences have become part of the curriculum in schools throughout their network. Children learn not just reading and mathematics and agricultural techniques, but the skills of moral reasoning that allow them to navigate complex ethical terrain, how to distinguish between people acting from fear and people acting from malice, how to offer mercy without enabling abuse, how to maintain hope without becoming naive. Dale watches these discussions with the satisfaction of someone whose lifetime's work has taken root in ways he never could have imagined, but also with the humility of someone who understands that each generation must learn these lessons for themselves. That wisdom cannot simply be inherited, but must be earned through experience. Randall's name has become something of a symbol in our communities, Dale reflects during the break in council proceedings, speaking to a small group of the most senior leaders. People talk about pulling a Randall when they mean choosing to trust someone, despite having good reasons not to. About Randall protocols when they mean taking the time to understand someone's motivations before deciding how to respond to them. The transformation of that frightened young man's name from a symbol of potential threat into a symbol of redemptive possibility represents more than just linguistic evolution. It reflects a fundamental shift in how their communities think about human nature, about the possibility of change, about the relationship between justice and mercy. But more than symbolic impact, the decision to spare Randall has had practical consequences that ripple through every aspect of their civilization. The intelligence he provided about raider tactics became the foundation for defensive strategies that saved hundreds of lives. The integration protocols they developed for incorporating him into their community became templates used successfully with dozens of other former enemies. The philosophical framework that guided their decision became the basis for legal systems that prioritize restoration over punishment. "I've been keeping count," Dale continues, his voice carrying the wonder of someone still amazed by the consequences of choices made years ago. People whose lives were saved because we chose mercy over execution, because we chose integration over elimination, because we chose to believe that people can change rather than assuming they can't. The number is approaching 800 now, spread across all our allied communities. The figure represents more than just lives preserved. It represents families formed, children born into stable communities, innovations developed, problems solved, conflicts resolved through cooperation rather than conquest. Each person whose life was touched by their approach to mercy and justice has gone on to touch other lives, creating a cascade of positive consequences that continues to expand. Carl's coming-of-age ceremony, held during the council sessions as representatives from across the network can serve as witnesses, becomes an opportunity to articulate what the younger generation has learned from watching their elders build something unprecedented from the ashes of the old world. "Dale Horvath saved my humanity," Carl says, his voice carrying across the packed community center to an audience that includes not just the council representatives, but families from throughout the region who have come to participate in the celebration. Not through grand gestures or dramatic interventions, but through the daily demonstration that mercy is practical, that compassion is strength, that people can choose to be better than what circumstances force them to become. The speech continues for nearly an hour, tracing the philosophical journey from Herschel's farm to Alexandria and beyond, cataloguing the lessons learned and the communities built and the lives transformed through the consistent application of principles that seemed naive to many, but have proven more durable than any purely pragmatic approach. The world that died during the outbreak wasn't just about technology or infrastructure or, economic systems, Carl concludes, his voice now carrying the authority of someone speaking for his entire generation. It was about the idea that human beings are essentially competitive rather than cooperative, that mercy is weakness, that the strong survive by dominating the weak. Dale taught us that the apocalypse was actually an opportunity to build something better, to prove that people can organize society around different principles if they're willing to do the work. As evening settles over Alexandria, Dale walks the expanded perimeter with the careful steps of someone whose body no longer moves as quickly as his mind, but whose understanding of the world continues to deepen with each passing year. The walls now encompass not just the original Alexandria, but several neighboring communities that chose integration over independence, creating a metropolitan area that houses nearly 15,000 people, representing dozens of different backgrounds, cultures, and approaches to survival. The success is measurable in ways both quantitative and qualitative. Agricultural output that not only feeds the local population, but produces surplus for trade. Educational systems that have achieved near-universal literacy within a single generation. Cultural institutions that preserve the best of the old world while creating new traditions appropriate to their circumstances. Democratic governance that has survived multiple crises without reverting to authoritarianism. But the success is also visible in smaller details that might seem insignificant to outside observers, but represent profound transformations to anyone who remembers the early days of pure survival. Children playing games that involve cooperation rather than competition. Adults from different communities working together on projects that benefit everyone. Former enemies serving together on councils and committees and governing bodies. We did something unprecedented, Dale reflects, as he settles into his favorite chair on the porch of the house he shares with several other elders from the original prison community. We proved that human beings are capable of learning from catastrophe rather than just surviving it, that mercy and justice can coexist, that democracy can function even under extreme pressure, that people can choose to build something better rather than just accepting whatever circumstances impose on them. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new opportunities to test and refine the principles they've spent decades developing. There will be conflicts that require all their accumulated wisdom to resolve. There will be decisions that determine not just their own future, but the future of post-apocalyptic civilization throughout the region. But tonight, as families gather for dinner in homes that were once strangers' houses, as former enemies share stories and former prisoners teach children, as democracy functions and mercy prevails and hope seems not just possible but inevitable, Dale allows himself to believe that the choice to spare rather than execute, to include rather than exclude, to cooperate rather than dominate, has created something that will outlive all of them. The boy named Randall, whose life hung in the balance in a barn on Herschel's farm, has become the foundation upon which hundreds of other lives have been built. The decision to show mercy to one frightened young man has become the cornerstone of a civilization that proves mercy is not just morally superior to cruelty. It's more practical, more sustainable, more likely to create the kind of future that people actually want to live in. It's not the victory anyone expected when they first chose compassion over expedience. But it's the victory that matters most, the victory of proving that human beings are capable of becoming better than what fear and desperation and trauma might make them, if they're given the chance and the support and the understanding necessary to make that choice. And in a world that forgot what better looked like, that memory has become the foundation for everything they've built since. Chapter 12. the long peace. The anniversary celebration begins at dawn, just as it has for the past 15 years, with the reading of the Randall Accord in the central square of Alexandria. But this year feels different, weighted with the knowledge that they are marking not just the birth of their civilization, but also approaching the end of an era as Dale Horvath enters his 78th year with the fragility that comes to even the strongest spirits when time finally claims its due. Children who have never known a world where mercy was considered weakness gather in circles around their elders, listening to the story that has become the founding myth of their society, the tale of a frightened young man whose life hung in the balance in a barn on a farm that no longer exists, and the old man whose words changed everything that came after. "Tell us about the choice," says Ana Martinez, 10 years old, and the daughter of parents who met in one of the refugee camps that the network established for displaced survivors. Her question carries the particular intensity that children bring to stories that define their world, that explain why things are the way they are, rather than some other way. Randall Culver stands before the assembled crowd, 42 years old now, and bearing the quiet authority of someone who has spent decades proving that second chances can be earned rather than just given. As the director of the Regional Rescue Coordination Network, he's personally overseen operations that have saved more than 3,000 lives, but his voice still carries the wonder of someone who remembers when his own life was measured in minutes rather than decades. "The choice wasn't really about me," Randall says, his voice carrying across the square to an audience that includes representatives from 47 different communities spread across 6 states. It was about who they wanted to be, about whether mercy and strength could coexist, about whether people could choose to build something better rather than just accepting whatever fear and desperation made them. The story he tells has been refined by 15 years of retelling, polished into a narrative that captures not just the facts of what happened, but the moral architecture that transformed a single decision into the foundation of a new kind of civilization. How Dale's argument for sparing him led to intelligence that saved the farm community. How his integration became a template used with hundreds of other former enemies. How the philosophical framework that guided their decision became the basis for legal systems that prioritize restoration over punishment. But this year's telling includes elements that have never been shared publicly before, details that Randall has saved for what everyone understands may be Dale's final anniversary celebration, the private conversations that convinced him his former group's approach was unsustainable, the moments of doubt when he wondered whether redemption was actually possible, the gradual recognition that the community that spared him was offering something unprecedented in the post-apocalyptic world, the chance to become better than what circumstances had made him. "Dale Horvath taught me that mercy isn't passive," Randall continues, his voice growing stronger as he approaches the climax of his story. "It's not just refraining from violence or avoiding cruelty. It's the active choice to believe that people can change, that circumstances don't have to define character, that the future can be different from the past if people are willing to do the work of making it different." From his seat on the platform constructed for the ceremony, Dale watches the faces in the crowd with the satisfaction of someone whose lifetime's work has taken root in ways he never could have imagined. Children who have grown up in communities where former enemies become family members, where conflicts are resolved through dialogue rather than violence, where mercy is taught alongside mathematics and moral reasoning is considered as essential as agricultural techniques. But it's the adults in the crowd who move him most deeply, people who remember the old ways, who lived through the transition from survival-based to principle-based community organization, who chose to embrace an approach that required more trust and more work, but produced more sustainable and more humane results. Rick Grimes takes the platform as the morning ceremony reaches its traditional climax, but the man who speaks is barely recognizable as the desperate sheriff who once stood in a barn debating whether to execute a prisoner. 4 decades of leadership guided by Dale's principles have created someone who embodies both compassion and strength, who understands that mercy and justice are not opposites, but complementary aspects of wisdom. 15 years ago today, Rick says, his voice carrying the authority of someone who has earned the right to speak for his entire civilization, we formalized what Dale Horvath taught us in a barn on Herschel's farm. That mercy is not weakness, but the foundation of sustainable strength. That people can choose cooperation over competition. That communities can be built around hope rather than fear. The speech that follows traces the practical applications of these principles across the network of allied communities, cataloging achievements that would have seemed impossible during their early days of pure survival. Educational systems that have achieved near-universal literacy within a generation. Agricultural innovations that have transformed the southeastern United States from a collection of struggling survivor settlements into a region of abundance. Conflict resolution protocols that have prevented hundreds of potential wars through diplomatic intervention. Most importantly, democratic governance structures that have proven robust enough to survive multiple crises without reverting to authoritarianism, flexible enough to adapt to changing circumstances, and compelling enough to inspire replication by communities throughout North America and beyond. The Dale Doctrine, which we formally adopt today as the constitutional foundation of our allied communities, represents more than just policy, Rick continues, holding up the document that has been years in the drafting, refined through countless discussions and debates, and practical applications. It represents proof that human beings are capable of learning from catastrophe rather than just surviving it. The Dale Doctrine itself reads like a philosophical treatise disguised as a legal framework, articulating principles that have been tested through 15 years of practical application. The presumption that people can change, given appropriate support and accountability. The commitment to seeking restorative rather than punitive justice whenever possible. The recognition that mercy and security are not opposites, but mutually reinforcing aspects of sustainable community. But more than formal policy, the doctrine represents the institutionalization of an approach to human relations that started with an old man's refusal to accept that cruelty was the only rational response to danger. The transformation of Dale's moral intuitions into systematic practices that can be taught, learned, and passed down to future generations. As the formal ceremonies conclude and the celebration transitions into the community feast that traditionally marks the anniversary, Dale finds himself surrounded by people whose lives have been shaped by decisions made decades ago, in circumstances that now seem almost mythical in their simplicity. Carl Grimes, now 38, and serving his second term as the elected coordinator of inter-community relations, brings his own children to meet the man who saved their grandfather's humanity. Watching Carl interact with his daughters, teaching them the same lessons about mercy and strength that Dale taught him, provides a glimpse of how principles survive beyond the people who originated them. They're growing up in a world where cooperation is normal, Carl says, watching his 8-year-old daughter Sophia mediate a dispute between younger children using techniques that have become standard curriculum in their schools. Where mercy is practical rather than naive, where the question isn't whether to trust people, but how to create conditions where trust can be safely extended and honored. Mary Thompson, the former Terminus resident who risked everything to help them escape, approaches Dale with the careful reverence that she's never quite lost, despite 15 years of proving her commitment to redemption. Now serving as the Director of Trauma Recovery Services for the network, she's helped hundreds of people navigate the psychological work of transforming from victims or perpetrators into contributing community members. "I've been thinking about forgiveness," she says, settling into a chair beside Dale with the careful movements of someone who still carries physical reminders of her darkest period. Not the kind that pretends terrible things didn't happen, but the kind that makes space for people to become better than what they were. "I think that's what you taught us, that forgiveness isn't about forgetting the past, but about refusing to let the past define the future." The conversation that follows touches on some of the deepest questions their civilization has grappled with over the years. How to balance accountability with mercy. How to create safety without sacrificing the possibility of redemption. How to build communities strong enough to survive betrayal, but flexible enough to accommodate genuine change. As afternoon fades into evening, Dale makes his way to the memorial garden, where stones mark the lives of those who didn't survive long enough to see their principles vindicated. Shane Walsh, whose name is carved with recognition of his service despite his inability to adapt to their evolving approach. Herschel Green, whose medical expertise saved countless lives and whose moral example reinforced Dale's teachings about the value of every human life. But it's the newest addition to the garden that draws Dale's attention, a stone marking the life of the governor, Philip Blake, whose name was added not in honor, but in recognition of the lesson his life represented about how trauma can transform good intentions into evil outcomes if mercy is abandoned in favor of expedience. Even he wasn't irredeemable, Dale reflects, speaking to Carl, who has joined him for what has become their traditional end-of-anniversary conversation. He was just too broken by betrayal to believe that cooperation was possible, too afraid that showing mercy would invite exploitation, too convinced that strength and cruelty were the same thing. "Do you think we could have reached him?" Carl asks, and the question carries the weight of 15 years of wondering about the paths not taken, the people who might have been saved with different approaches or better timing or more wisdom. "Maybe," Dale says, his voice carrying the accumulated wisdom of someone who has spent decades grappling with the practical applications of mercy. But probably not. Some people are too damaged by trauma to accept help, too convinced that violence is the only rational response to danger. That doesn't make them evil exactly, but it makes them incompatible with the kind of community we're trying to build. The distinction feels crucial, even after all these years. Their approach to mercy and justice isn't naive about human nature or ignorant of genuine threats. It's simply committed to the principle that people should be given every reasonable opportunity to choose cooperation over conflict, redemption over destruction, hope over despair. As night settles over Alexandria and the anniversary celebration transitions into the quiet conversations and storytelling that traditionally conclude the day, Dale finds himself surrounded by the extended family he helped create. Not just biological relatives, but the hundreds of people whose lives have been shaped by his decision to believe that mercy is practical rather than naive, that people can change, that communities can be built around principles that prioritize human dignity over simple survival. Rick joins him on the porch of the house they've shared for the past 5 years, both men moving with the careful deliberation that age imposes even on the strongest spirits. The conversation that follows touches on everything and nothing, memories of people long gone, observations about the children who will inherit what they've built, hopes for futures they may not live to see. "I've been thinking about legacy," Rick says, his voice carrying the particular thoughtfulness that comes to people in their final years. Not just what we accomplished, but whether it will last, whether the next generation really understands why we made the choices we made, whether they'll continue making those choices when we're not here to explain them. "Look around," Dale replies, gesturing toward the community center, where teenagers are planning next month's inter-community youth exchange, toward the workshop where former enemies work together on engineering projects that will benefit communities throughout the region, toward the homes where families gather for dinner, regardless of their backgrounds or histories. The choices aren't ours anymore. They belong to people who've grown up believing that cooperation is normal, that mercy is strength, that the future is something to be built together rather than simply endured in isolation. 3 weeks later, Dale Horvath dies peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by people who represent every phase of his journey from desperate survivor to moral philosopher to architect of post-apocalyptic civilization. Rick and Carl, whose development as leaders was shaped by his influence. Randall, whose life was saved by his intervention. Mary and dozens of other former enemies who found redemption through his commitment to the possibility of human change. The funeral that follows is unlike anything the old world would have recognized. Not a ceremony of grief, but a celebration of principles proven, a recognition of how one person's refusal to accept cruelty as inevitable helped reshape an entire civilization. Representatives from communities across North America speak about policies inspired by his example. Children read essays about growing up in a world where mercy is considered practical. Former enemies stand together to honor the man who taught them that their past didn't have to define their future. But it's Randall who delivers the final eulogy, speaking for all the people whose lives were touched by Dale's decision to believe that human beings are capable of becoming better than what circumstances force them to be. Dale Horvath taught us that mercy is not the opposite of justice, but its fulfillment, Randall says, his voice carrying across the packed auditorium to an audience that includes people from 47 different communities. That compassion is not the opposite of strength, but its highest expression. That people can choose to build something better, rather than just accepting whatever fear and desperation and trauma might make them. The words echo those spoken 15 years earlier in a barn on a farm that no longer exists, but they carry the weight of a civilization that has proven mercy is more than just moral idealism. It's practical wisdom about what people can accomplish when they choose cooperation over conquest, hope over despair, love over fear. In the months that follow Dale's death, communities throughout the network implement the Dale Memorial Protocols, formal structures for extending mercy to potential enemies, for offering redemption to people who have lost their way, for building the kind of society where human dignity is treated as a resource rather than a luxury. The world that emerges from these implementations isn't perfect. No human society can be perfect, but it's a world where children grow up believing that people can change, where former enemies become family members, where mercy and strength coexist in ways that would have seemed impossible during the dark years that followed the outbreak. And in that world, on quiet evenings when families gather for dinner and former enemies share stories and children play games that involve cooperation rather than competition, Dale Horvath's voice can still be heard in every choice to trust rather than suspect, to include rather than exclude, to build rather than simply survive. The choice to spare rather than execute, made in a moment of crisis by an old man who refused to accept that cruelty was inevitable, became the foundation upon which an entire civilization rebuilt itself. Not the civilization anyone expected, but the civilization everyone needed, one consciously designed around human dignity rather than simple survival, around hope rather than fear, around the radical possibility that people can choose to be better than what the worst moments of their lives might make them. It's the victory that no one could have imagined when the dead first started walking. But it's the victory that mattered most. Proof that the end of the old world didn't have to mean the end of everything decent about human nature. That mercy is not weakness, but the foundation of sustainable strength. That people can choose cooperation over conquest if they're given the chance, and the support and the understanding necessary to make that choice. And in a world that had forgotten what better looked like, that choice became the light that guided them home.